Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chapter 76, The World is an Insalvageable Ash. 6 hours later. Following the dozen flower sect disciples, the carriage arrived outside a mountain ridge. Because of the rugged mountain road, the carriage could no longer pass through. Li Yueming and Wang Ermeizi could only get out of the car and walk up the mountain. The flower sect was one of the last among the 12 sects in Lingnan. Most of the disciples in the sect were female. It was rumored that the grand elder of the flower sect was an outer disciple of the heavenly mystic sect, one of the top 5 sects in the central plains of China, 30 years ago. He had already broken through to the Grand Master realm and had a chance of becoming a core disciple of the Tianxian sect. However, he fell in love with a core disciple of the inner section. In the end, she was hurt. Not only did his martial arts realm plummet, but he also fell from a martial arts Grand Master to a peak martial king. He was even expelled from the Gate of Heavenly Mystery because he had violated the sect rules. From then on, he would never recover. He wandered to Lingnan and finally established the flower sect. Her malice and vicious methods towards men were an existence that made countless people's expressions change even among martial artists. Hence, the two of them were in a daze. The status of male disciples in the flower sect was very low. Most of the men who could be summoned in the flower sect were servants and handymen of female disciples. There were only a small number of disciples. When he followed the female disciple up the mountain, the male disciples of the flower sect that Li Yueming saw along the way all had their heads lowered. He did not dare to look at the female disciple beside him. However, when he secretly looked at Li Yueming, his gaze was not as gentle. Most of the time, they looked at Li Yueming as if he was a dead man. Li Yueming didn't really care about these things. He was just curious if the flower sect's cultivation technique had a shadow of the cultivation technique of one of the 5 great sects in China, the Tianxian sect. One had to know that last time, he had already glimpsed some of the profundities of the primordial chaos everlasting sect's cultivation technique in the cultivation technique of the everlasting cloud sect. If he could still find the Tianxian sect's cultivation technique in the flower sect's cultivation technique this time, the increase in his combat strength would be terrifying. After all, ordinary second-rate sex cultivation techniques were completely tasteless to him. Only the cultivation techniques of the top sects in Huaxia could provide him with some nutrients. The group of people walked through 7 or 8 mountain valleys. Finally, they arrived at a staircase made of bluestone. When he arrived at the bluestone stairs, not far away, under an arched door, stood a young girl of about 15 or 16 years old. The girl had a flawless oval face. Her eyebrows were curved, her nose was like flawless white jade, and her eyes were as deep and bright as clear water. She was very beautiful. The most eye-catching thing was that there was a mole at the corner of her left eye. It made her look both demonic and charming. In addition to that, she had a pair of straight and smooth legs that were as delicate and straight as white jade. Just standing there from a distance, it was inevitable that people would feel a sense of desecration. When the group of female disciples saw the young girl, they hurriedly bowed and said respectfully, "Disciple greets Holy Maiden." The young girl waved her hand, indicating that there was no need to be so polite. Then, she glanced at Li Yueming and Wang Ermeizi and said, "The 2 young masters are not locals, right? Do you know what this place is?" "Miss, although we are not locals, the name of the flower sect is still very famous in Lingnan." Li Yueming's gaze also swept over the girl. It had to be said. This kind of charming and pure woman was really difficult for ordinary men to handle. Women and whatnot. Being too beautiful would affect the speed of drawing the saber. But it's fine, I can still hold on. Hurry up and get more. He felt Li Yueming's gaze. The young girl frowned slightly, but she didn't say anything in the end. He glanced at the dozen or so women who were leading the way. After gesturing for them to retreat, only then did he come forward and softly said, "Since young master knows about the flower sect, do you know that you are not far from death?" Li Yueming thought for a moment and shook his head. After all, in his opinion, it was still uncertain who was not far from death. The young girl's face revealed a hint of anger, but she barely managed to maintain her composure. He whispered again, "The flower sect is a place that eats people without spitting out their bones. If you want a chance of survival, quickly jump down from here." The holy maiden waved her long sleeves and left without looking back. There were many unscrupulous people in the flower sect, and there were also some who had a conscience that had not yet been extinguished. Actually, this was very normal. Just like how a place filled with light would have darkness, a place filled with darkness would occasionally have wisps of light. Light and darkness were never contradictory in the absolute sense. The fundamental tone of this world was actually an unstoppable, unchangeable, and even undetectable gray composition. There was no absolute right and wrong. And this so-called saintess in front of him had come to remind him at this time. It even helped him disperse the burning acacia silk pollen that was permeating the surroundings. This would give him a chance to escape. This meant that not everyone in the flower sect was crazy. Of course, it was impossible for Li Yueming to escape. After the holy maiden left, the female disciples who had retreated to the side quickly gathered around again. Under their lead, Li Yueming walked up the stone stairs. A huge square that was almost 1,000 meters wide and paved with bluestone appeared in front of Li Yueming. At the center of the square, a haggard old woman sat cross-legged beside a huge pill furnace. The furnace was still burning with flames. The old woman was stooping as she added medicinal herbs into the pot. Before Li Yueming could react, the few women who were leading the way suddenly knelt on the ground and kowtowed. "Grand Elder, the precious medicine has already been brought." He heard a sound. The old woman who was adding firewood slowly turned around and sized up Li Yueming with her turbid eyes. Suddenly, a burst of light erupted. He could not help but nod repeatedly and say, "Essence energy is overflowing, and you're still a child? Not bad, not bad, hurry up and bring this child over. If we use him as a medicinal catalyst, this cauldron of longevity extending pills might have an unexpected effect." He looked at the crazy old witch not far away. Presumably, this guy was the rumored extremely crazy Grand Elder. Next to his pill furnace, there were even more than 10 chickens that had been stripped naked and washed. At a glance, the entire scene was very bloody. Li Yueming frowned and couldn't help but laugh in anger. He, "I want to see what you can refine by throwing an old witch like you into the furnace." The old woman didn't care what he said. He only said to the surrounding disciples, "You have to be captured alive. You can't be scratched or knocked. If the effects of the medicine are reduced, I'll throw you in and burn you." The old woman's face was ferocious and terrifying. The surrounding disciples trembled as they bowed and obeyed. Nearly 1,000 flower sect disciples dressed in all kinds of clothes rushed towards Li Yueming. They waved their sleeves. Countless crystalline powder sprayed out from his sleeve. These were all charm powder made from various pollen and medicinal herbs. Warriors and ordinary people who had never practiced the flower sect's cultivation technique would be affected by the poison after inhaling the powder. They would collapse to the ground and be slaughtered. The entire square was filled with dancing demons. There was a reason why the flower sect's combat strength was ranked at the bottom of the 12 sects in Lingnan. Most of the flower sect's disciples did not practice proper offensive techniques. Instead, they relied on all kinds of despicable methods to fight. For ordinary martial artists, this little trick might be extremely effective. However, this kind of underhanded trick was not worth mentioning to Li Yueming at all. He opened his mouth and took a deep breath. Before the powder in his mouth could disperse, then, with lightning speed, he urged the incomparably fierce qi in his body to spew out. The surging airflow turned into a gust of wind. It blew away the powder scattered by the flower sect disciples. With Li Yueming as the center, it spread out in a circular arc. A colorful demonic wind blew across the entire square. Countless flower sect disciples were choked by the poisonous powder. Soon, her face turned red. Chapter 77, Give him a back in his own way. In the blink of an eye, the entire square of the flower sect was in a mess. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Li Yueming turned his head and signaled Wang Ermeiza not to get involved. He then rushed towards the center of the square where the pill furnace was. Today, he had to sacrifice this damned old witch alive. He rushed over aggressively. The old witch's face also turned gloomy. She had always thought that Li Yueming was just a toothless puppy. However, he never expected that in just a blink of an eye, this harmless puppy would suddenly turn into a big bad wolf that bared its teeth. He watched as Li Yueming got closer and closer to him. The old woman glanced at the raging fire in the pill furnace. He resisted the urge to do it himself and said, "Where are the elders and hall masters of the third courtyard? Capture this brat for me, I want to throw him into the pill furnace alive." Her voice was very sharp. Upon hearing the order, 5 or 6 figures immediately charged out from the pavilion not far from the square. These martial artists were also women, but they were all around the age of 30. They were all at the martial king realm. Among them, the 2 strongest elders were already at the mid-level martial king realm. Only a woman with a white veil over her face was the weakest. She should have just broken through to the martial king realm not long ago. These people should be the elders and hall masters of the flower sect. They were the core of the flower sect. Li Yueming's face revealed an eager expression. Even though he was still at the peak of the martial master realm. However, the Qi Jin in his body was many times stronger than that of an ordinary martial master. In addition to the extreme polishing of his body when he was a martial apprentice. Even now, he was not afraid of the martial king Li Yueming. This aroused his fighting spirit. After all, he had been cultivating alone for half a year, and it had been a long time since he had moved his body freely. Just as he was adjusting his body's condition, a few women flew over and shot out nearly 100 poison darts from their sleeves. These poison darts were extremely fast. Every poison dart was extremely sharp, and they were also coated with a lethal poison. Even a martial king realm expert would be severely injured if they were pierced by these poisonous darts. Looking at the nearly 100 poison darts that covered the sky, Li Yueming's fists shook violently. An extremely thick inner qi gushed out from his fingertips, turning into a huge air wave that swept out. In the blink of an eye, they heard a series of crisp clanging sounds. The poison darts shot out by the flower sect elder were all shaken to the ground by the inner qi dragons visible to the naked eye. The hidden weapons fell like rain. The few elders of the flower faction who had suddenly appeared felt their brains short-circuit. For a moment, he wondered if there was a problem with the way he entered the stage. This level of inner qi. Was it really something a young man could have? An ordinary martial master's inner qi was already considered to be of good aptitude when it was 5 or 6 meters away from their body. Even if an ordinary martial king condensed his physique and inner qi to the extreme, his inner qi would only be able to leave his body less than 30 meters away. The hidden weapons they threw out were still nearly 50 meters away from Li Yueming. This young man who looked less than 18 years old actually used his inner qi to shoot down such a huge number of hidden weapons. It was more than 50 meters away from the body and still had such a powerful attack power. Was this really the inner qi of their understanding? Why did he suddenly feel so unfamiliar? Before the elders could come back to their senses, Li Yueming had already rushed over at an extraordinary speed. After getting close to them, Li Yueming pointed his fingers upwards. One of the flower sect elders closest to him immediately felt as if his soul had left his body. Under the situation where his entire body was creeped out, he barely turned around and barely avoided the vital parts of the slash. Li Yueming's slash still left a half-inch long wound on her abdomen. It was just a simple finger. It had directly injured a martial king realm elder of the flower sect. Li Yueming had displayed heaven-defying combat strength. It really made all the flower sect disciples present who could still maintain their consciousness feel their scalps go numb. The other elders seemed to have woken up from a dream. Looking at Li Yueming, who was getting closer and closer to them, two of the elders gritted their teeth and rushed down. They thought that Li Yueming was at most a martial king realm expert. Li Yueming had a very contradictory feeling. Judging from the performance of the Qi Jin in his body, logically speaking, Li Yueming should be at least a high-level martial king. However, he did not have the aura of a martial king, and his combat techniques seemed to be stuck at the martial master realm. However, Li Yueming was not a martial king. Then, the combat strength that he had enslaved was not something that an ordinary martial king could achieve. This made these flower sect elders puzzled. In order to prevent Li Yueming from using that strange internal qi again, the two elders pounced over at the same time. He wanted to rely on the body of a martial king to suppress Li Yueming. After all, in their opinion, martial artists always had their strengths and weaknesses. Li Yueming's inner qi was so strong that his physical body would definitely be his shortcoming. When they had such thoughts, he was not far from death. Li Yueming raised his hand when he saw the two elders approaching him. All his strength was tightly compressed into his fist. The moment one of the martial king realm elders got close to her, he punched her face. The elder raised an arm to block. A dagger dipped in poison appeared in his other hand, and he slashed at Li Yueming's throat. In her opinion, Li Yueming's punch would not threaten her life. After blocking it with one hand, she would be able to use the poisoned dagger to gain the upper hand. She knew how wrong she was. Li Yueming's fist was like a tiger. It was the first to hit the flower sect elder's arm. The flower sect elder's lips curled into a smile, but before he could laugh out loud, it froze on his face. However, Li Yueming's fist instantly broke her arm. It charged at her face at an unstoppable speed. The elder's face paled, and he could not be bothered to counterattack. He tried his best to stop it. However, how could she compete with Li Yueming's bull-like body? The fist broke through the layers of defense. He still resolutely made intimate contact with the elder's face. The elder's face was twisted by Li Yueming's slap. It looked extremely ferocious and terrifying. It had to be said that the body of a martial king was completely different. If this punch was a martial master, his entire head would probably explode like a watermelon. Knock this one down. Another flower sect elder held a thin sword in his hand. At this moment, he was about to stab into Li Yueming's chest. Li Yueming pulled the unconscious elder over and took the sword for himself. Then, he seized the opportunity to grab the arm of another elder and smashed him heavily on the ground. The elder coughed out a few mouthfuls of blood and fell unconscious after struggling for a while. Just now, the flower sect had sent out a total of 6 elders. In just 5 minutes, 2 of them were taken care of by Li Yueming. Among the remaining 3, one of them was seriously injured in the abdomen. Such a battle record. For a moment, everyone was silent. The remaining 3 elders looked at each other and decided to change their tactics. They wanted to find an opportunity through long-distance harassment and attacks. However, Li Yueming, who already had a rough understanding of his own strength, did not have much patience for them. He gathered all the aphrodisiac poison powder that had yet to disperse not far away. After collecting enough medicinal powder, Li Yueming controlled his qi and spat the powder at the 3 elders. This move was called a taste of one's own medicine. The internal energy cultivated by the flower ancestor could produce a certain resistance to the poison in the pollen. However, this did not mean that they were completely immune to the effects of pollen. Moreover, he had to be careful. Li Yueming used his inner strength to stir it up. The effect of countless aphrodisiac powders mixed together was dozens of times more terrifying than before. The flower sect disciples whose cultivation levels were not high could not withstand such a powerful medicinal effect at all. Even an elder in the martial king realm could only resist for a while with his physique and inner chi. After inhaling a certain amount, it would also cause true damage. As a result, the colorful powder spread out. Including the 3 elders who were the first to bear the brunt, countless flower sect disciples' legs began to turn weak and their faces flushed red. Moaning and decadent sounds filled the air. "Little brother, let's play together. Good brother, quickly give it to me. Will you woo?" Even Li Yueming's eyelids twitched as he looked at the paralyzed woman. It seemed like he couldn't handle it. Chapter 78, A Pill Refiner Must Finish What He Begins, _1. On the square of the flower sect. Nearly 1,000 women, including the group of elders, collapsed on the ground. Shuangming was in a daze. Even Li Yueming was speechless. He had thought that after 10 years of killing fish, his heart had become colder than the knife in his hand. But now, it seemed that his cultivation was still not enough. If he really encountered a big situation, he would not be able to suppress the gun. He ignored the other disciples who were lying on the ground. Li Yueming pulled out the long saber at his waist and looked at the old witch not far away with killing intent. The old woman's face was already so gloomy that water was about to drip out. Looking at the flames that were still rising in the pill furnace, he gritted his teeth and said, "You bunch of useless trash. So many people can't even defeat a child who hasn't even reached the age of 18. This seat's cauldron of medicinal pills is only an hour away from being formed. Now, I have to personally take action, Brad. Even 100 of your lives won't be enough to compensate for this." The old woman had no choice but to put down the medicinal herbs in her hand and look at the murderous Li Yueming. Even though he was constantly belittling Li Yueming. But in reality, the old woman had already tensed up. 30 years ago, she was an outstanding disciple of one of the top 5 sects in Huaxia. Even though his cultivation had regressed. But his vision was still there. Even the direct disciples of the 5 great sects were not as powerful as Li Yueming, who could fight a martial king at the age of 18. Could it be that they were the disciples of those hidden sects that even the imperial emperor, who had founded Great Xia, didn't dare to touch? The old woman still hadn't figured it out. On the other hand, Li Yueming obviously wouldn't give her too much time to think. He had already drawn his saber and was ready to attack. Along the way from the foot of the mountain, he saw that the flower sect had done too much evil. They occupied the farmland to plant flowers and plants, causing the nearby farmers to have no land to plant. They starved to death every year and sold their children. They plundered the children of the nearby villages. Some of them were lucky enough to enter the sect and become maids. Those with better root bones were directly washed and sent into the pill furnace to refine longevity-extending pills and youth-retaining pills. His actions could be described as evil. Many times, Li Yueming was not a caring person. His kindness and gentleness would only be left to a few people who cared about him and the people he cared about. Most of the time, he had a cold face. However, this did not mean that he was cold-blooded. When he encountered injustice, he would also be furious. He unsheathed his saber. Li Yueming took a few deep breaths. He adjusted his entire body to its peak condition at the fastest speed possible. He disappeared from his spot at a speed that was unimaginable to ordinary people. The old woman extinguished the pill fire in the pill furnace. 2 zombie-like eyes stared at Li Yueming as if they wanted to swallow him alive. Seeing Li Yueming disappear, he had to be handed over. Without hesitation, the old woman took 2 steps back and took out an iron bone fan to block her neck. Clang! A jarring sound of metal colliding rang out. The iron bone fan in the old woman's hand blocked the blade of Li Yueming's long saber. He pushed hard. It actually pushed Li Yueming's long blade back by a few centimeters. Li Yueming's pupils constricted. The old witch was able to rule the flower sect for so many years. She was indeed quite capable. The strength of his physique was actually on par with his. But what he did not know was, the shock and astonishment in the old woman's heart was 10 times stronger than his. What realm was she at? At her peak, she was a martial arts grandmaster. Although his current realm had fallen, it was only because he could no longer touch the power of laws. Her physical body was still at the level of a martial arts grandmaster. That was why she was able to live to nearly 130 years old and still have a light body. However, Li Yueming only had 13 or 14 points of water. He could actually fight against her physical body. The word monster could no longer explain this terrifying phenomenon. It was simply the ultimate monster that had never been heard of in the thousands of years of martial arts history. Even the founding emperor of the Great Xia Kingdom was nothing in front of this youth. At this moment, the old woman was already beginning to feel afraid. Not only was he afraid of Li Yueming's strength, but he was also afraid of Li Yueming's unfathomable background. Unfortunately, Li Yueming didn't give her any chance. The first slash didn't work, so the second slash immediately came. Seeing this, the old woman could only dispel all the messy thoughts in her mind and began to fight wholeheartedly. Li Yueming had fought to his heart's content. It could only be said that the old woman was indeed an existence who had once reached the realm of martial arts grandmaster. Whether it was her own strength or combat experience, she was very experienced. When he fought with her, Li Yueming truly felt the charm of martial arts. Every move had its own special rhythm. Many times, even if it was just a slight mistake, the enemy would seize the opportunity in a life and death battle, and the result would be 1,000 miles away in the blink of an eye. This was an art that belonged to martial artists. It transcended life and death. Unfortunately, the old woman was destined to fail from the very beginning. When Li Yueming activated the Star Moon art and began to unleash his full strength, it was only 3 slashes. Li Yueming, whose entire body was emitting a ferocious aura, chopped off the old woman's head and threw it into the alchemy furnace that had yet to completely extinguish the flames. He looked at the boiling medicine in the furnace. Li Yueming kicked the old woman's corpse into the pill furnace. He was very considerate and added fuel to the fire that was about to extinguish. The old witch had used many people to refine medicine in her life. Now, she was also sent into the alchemy furnace. In a sense, this was a perfect closed loop. Alchemists had to finish what they started. He looked at the messy battlefield. Li Yueming heaved a sigh of relief. Wang Ermei's face was a little numb. Fortunately, he had traveled with Li Ming for many years, so Wang Ermei knew how terrifying his young master was. From the Li residence at the beginning to the King du Port. When had his young master not killed a lot of people when he went out? This time, he had only killed an old witch. Although this old witch was the grand elder of the 12 sects in Lingnan, she was still a powerful figure. His strength was slightly stronger than those martial apprentices and martial masters from before. But the young master had always been unfathomable. To Wang Ermei, this was nothing. He bypassed a group of flower sect disciples who were still moaning. Wang Ermei walked over and whispered, "It's really easy on the old witch. I think it's not too much to hang her up and cut her into pieces." Li Yueming just smiled and said, "I'll leave the 1,000 cuts to the King of Hell. My mission is to send her to the King of Hell." Wang Ermei also smiled and said, "Yes, young master doesn't touch dirty blood." After dealing with the grand elder of the flower sect, most of the surrounding flower sect's ordinary disciples had basically lost their combat strength. Li Yueming didn't have any perverted interest in killing people to vent his anger. His gaze swept past the group of women who were paralyzed on the ground. Finally, he looked at the few elders who were still not fully conscious. A few elders nearby who were still alive could not help but shiver. They wanted to find a place to hide immediately. Or they could learn the ability to play dead so that they could escape the gaze of this god of death. However, this thought was destined to be a wild hope. Li Yueming slowly walked towards them and went straight to an elder who seemed to be still sober. He asked, "Where do you store the cultivation techniques of your clan?" The elder was already dizzy from the various mixed powders. When he heard Li Yueming's voice, he subconsciously reacted. Her strength was high enough to reach the intermediate rank of a martial king. Therefore, he was not completely disturbed by the poison. He could only bite the bullet and answer reluctantly, "In the library in the back hall." Li Yueming glanced at her. He kicked her chest and said, "If I hear that you're doing evil here again, I'll kill you from 1,000 miles away, understand?" This kick was quite heavy. The elder coughed out a mouthful of blood. "Thank you for sparing my life, exalted immortal. I understand. I will definitely be kind to others in the future. Eat vegetarian food and pray to Buddha, no longer killing." In his nervousness, the elder even bit his tongue a few times. Li Yueming stared at her for a moment and didn't say anything else. He brought Wang Ermeize to the library in the back hall. However, just as he walked past a veiled woman, a slender hand suddenly grabbed his trouser leg. However, a graceful woman with confused eyes said, "Young master, where are you going?" Li Yueming didn't want to bother about it. However, after taking 2 steps, he suddenly stopped. He turned around and looked at the woman. Nothing else. It was because the woman had a very attractive mole at the corner of her left eye. Chapter 79, 78, Do you think this is human language, _L. He looked at the masked woman who was kneeling on the ground and tugging at his trousers. Although she was wearing a veil, the mole at the corner of her left eye was still very eye-catching. Li Yueming stopped and asked, "Are you all right?" He had already recognized it. The woman in front of him should be the saintess who had reminded him to escape from the flower sect. The holy maiden did not reply. At this moment, her eyes were a little confused. As a new martial king, her foundation was obviously not as deep as the other elders. Therefore, she was the most affected by the powder among the elders. She grabbed Li Yueming's pants. The holy maiden's face was flushed red. She stuck close to him and said, "Young master, bring this little girl away from this place. Even if I have to be a slave or a maidservant, this little girl does not wish to stay in this purgatory on earth." The old woman was not only ruthless to outsiders. He was also extremely ruthless to the disciples of the section. The slightest mistake would only be punished with the lightest whip. Some unlucky people would even be thrown into the alchemy furnace by the old woman to become ingredients for alchemy. Many flower sect disciples actually did not have much sense of belonging to the flower sect. The only reason why he stayed here was because of the old woman's tyranny. Now, the old woman was dead. It was normal for the Holy Virgin to want to leave. Then, he swept his gaze across the group of women around him. Silently, he took out a gourd of cold water from the bag on Wang Er's back and poured it directly on the girl's head. He was showering. "I think you should wake up first," Li Yueming said. After watering, Li Yueming then left the library without turning back. Wang Ermeize, who witnessed everything, was speechless. He could only say that the young master was indeed the young master. Women and whatnot, he just killed them. The Holy Virgin of the flower sect was also stunned. He looked at Li Yueming's back as he left. He did not come to his senses for a long time. The flower sect's library was divided into 3 levels. After entering the library, Li Yueming began to count the books one by one. The first floor was mostly filled with unimportant books. The second level was slightly better. It was filled with many martial arts techniques. However, Li Yueming lost interest after a few glances. It was no wonder that the flower sect disciples' combat strength was so weak. The root of it was the messy martial arts moves in the library. Most of them were just for show, and there were only a few that could really fight. He threw away all these messy dregs. Li Yueming went straight to the third floor of the library pavilion. There were fewer books on the third floor. Ordinary disciples probably didn't even have the qualifications to come up. The flower sect was a second-rate section. The top floor of the library naturally had more than one cultivation technique. He found 8 rather interesting cultivation techniques among the dozens of messy cultivation techniques. 2 of them were martial apprentices, 2 were martial masters, 3 were martial kings, and the last one was a remnant of a grandmaster. The reason why Li Yueming traveled all the way from Qingdu to the flower sect was because he was a young man. His main goal was to collect cultivation techniques to break through to the martial king realm. Now that they had taken down a flower sect, they had found 3 martial king realm cultivation techniques at once. There was even a remnant of a martial arts grandmaster realm book. Such a harvest could be said to be a surprise that exceeded his expectations. After informing Wang Ermeize that he was going into seclusion, Li Yueming went straight to the third floor of the library pavilion to study. Among the 12 sects in Lingnan, the flower sect was ranked at the very end. Despite this, Li Yueming still spent a lot of effort to resolve the flower sect's old woman. This was obvious. The other 11 sects would definitely be even stronger. Just to be safe, Li Yueming decided to visit the other sects after the flower sect broke through to the martial king realm. In the blink of an eye, 2 months passed. During these 2 months, Li Yueming stayed in the flower sect's library and did not leave. Wang Ermeize, on the other hand, was bitterly in charge of the cleanup work of the girl who had turned over a new leaf. After pouring cold water on the group of female disciples in heat on the square, after about half a day, the entire flower sect finally regained its usual peace. Otherwise, if they kept whining, those who didn't know would think that they were doing something indecent. When all the disciples woke up, Wang Ermeize, who was using his power as a fox, temporarily forbade them from going down the mountain. He also took this opportunity to brainwash the flower sect disciples with Pua. However, to Wang Ermeize's surprise, the entire flower sect was far more enthusiastic than he had imagined. A few elders who had not died even took the initiative to express their desire for Li Yueming to succeed the position of the flower sect's sect master. Furthermore, he kept hinting that as long as he became the sect leader of the flower sect, all the disciples in the flower sect would be able to serve Jun Kaija towards their unrestrained and free will. Even Wang Ermeize felt his scalp go numb. How was this a flower sect? This was clearly a country of women. No, I can't hold on anymore. Young master, hurry up and come out of seclusion to save me. On the 3rd month, Li Yueming broke the window of the library pavilion with a kick. He jumped down from the window sill. He found Wang Ermeize, who was guarding the door, and said, "Go, go, go, go." He looked at the figure that suddenly appeared in front of him. Wang Ermeize's face was filled with horror and fear. At that moment, he realized that he didn't even know when Li Yueming had appeared beside him. In the past, Wang Ermeize could also guess Li Yueming's strength from his aura. Then, Li Yueming's current strength and realm might have completely exceeded his understanding and cognition. He became even more reserved. With his strength, he couldn't even see the depths of Li Yueming's body. This was undoubtedly very terrifying. After all, an existence that could make him, a martial master, feel nothing was at least at the martial king realm. But how old was Li Yueming? He was only 12 years old. A 12-year-old martial master. It had completely refreshed Wang Ermeize's understanding of geniuses. Even if a child of the same age started practicing martial arts from the womb, they would probably be an ordinary martial master at most. One could imagine how shocked Wang Ermeize was. He packed his bag. Li Yueming and Wang Ermeize prepared to head to the next stop. After all, the 12 sects of Lingnan were neither too many nor too few. If they didn't speed fast on the road, Li Yueming didn't even know if he would be able to return to Qingdu Harbor this year. Naturally, the shorter the time spent on the road, the better. He quickly finished collecting the cultivation technique manuals. After a year and a half of studying at home, the path of martial arts would be broad. However, when the two of them were about to leave, he discovered that the flower sect's huge square made of green stone slabs was filled with female disciples. Li Yueming glanced at Wang Ermeize. Wang Ermeize seemed to be a little confused about this. The two of them were still puzzled. A few elders suddenly stood up and said, "Young Master Li, this subordinate here welcomes you to ascend to the position of the flower sect's sect master. From today onwards, the flower sect's 3,000 disciples will obey your orders." He finished speaking. A group of women knelt on the ground. He bowed to Li Yueming as a disciple. Li Yueming was a little confused. It seemed that 2 or 3 months ago, they were still mortal enemies. In the blink of an eye, they suddenly became sect masters. What was going on? He seemed to have sensed his doubts. The leader of the elders bowed and said, "Young master, please take pity on us weak women. The biggest reason why the flower sect can be ranked at the bottom of the 12 sects is that the previous Grand Elder was a half-step Grandmaster. Now that the Grand Elder has died at your hands, if the flower sect wants to continue surviving in the cracks of the other 11 sects, they can only rely on you to have a chance of survival." Hearing this, Li Yueming's face revealed a strange expression. These few elders probably never dreamed that the flower sect was just the starting point of Li Yueming's journey. Li Yueming's true purpose was to kill the enemy. It was to trample all the 12 sects according to their rankings. Li Yueming said, "Don't worry, it won't be long before the other 11 sects follow in your footsteps." The flower sect disciples. They had already guessed Li Yueming's attitude in advance. They were either happy or angry. Or perhaps he would be ruthless to them again. However, she never expected Li Yueming to say that the other 11 sects would follow in their footsteps soon. Look at this. Is this human language? After hearing his answer, for a moment, all the flower sect disciples present fell into an endless silence. Chapter 80, One Man Shakes Lingnan. Li Yueming did not intend to stay any longer and was ready to leave. The young girl who had already changed her clothes followed him. Li Yueming looked confused. The young girl said enthusiastically, "My lord, my daughter has been trapped in the sect since she was young and has never seen the outside world. Thank you for killing that old witch and regaining her freedom. So, can my daughter travel with you for a while?" As the holy maiden of the flower sect, Yananyuan's fate was extremely tragic. His parents had died when he was young. After he was picked up by the flower sect, he quickly attracted the attention of the Grand Elder because of his intelligence. The Grand Elder checked her root bone and found that she had a martial arts spiritual body that was rarely seen in 100 years. He was overjoyed and immediately accepted her as his personal disciple. At the age of 10, he had already displayed astonishing talent. He had broken through from the martial apprentice realm to the martial master realm in one go. With her identity and status, she should be living a carefree life. But later, in an accidental discovery, Yananyuan finally saw her master's true colors. The reason why he liked her so much and raised her on the mountain in luxurious clothes and jade food, forbidding her from taking a step out. The real reason was that he wanted to extend her lifespan with the soul transference technique of the ancient demon sect when she was at her wit's end. The reason why her parents died was actually because of the Grand Elder. Yananyuan finally understood what kind of environment she was in. He felt a deep sense of despair. Li Yueming had actually killed her venomous master on the spot. This undoubtedly untied the shackles on her body. Yananyuan was wearing a light red dress, and the fluttering of the belt made her look more like a young girl. Yingying looked at Li Yueming expectantly, hoping that she could follow behind this young man and open her eyes to take a good look at the outside world. Li Yueming looked at her from head to toe and said, "I'm preparing to go to the Qingyun sect now. Are you sure you want to come with me?" The smile on Yananyuan's face froze. What kind of place was the Qingyun sect? It was one of the top 3 sects among the 12 sects in Lingnan. They were only one step away from becoming a first-tier sect, and they were only lacking a powerful martial Dao Grand Master Elder. Such a section. Even if the Grand Elder was resurrected, their flower sect did not dare to provoke them. Not to mention that she had just broken through to the martial king realm not long ago. After a moment of silence, Yananyuan took a few deep breaths before she blinked and said weakly, "Young master, can I wait for you at the foot of the mountain?" Li Yu glanced at her. He left without saying anything else. She watched him leave. Yananyuan hesitated for a moment, then gritted her teeth and stomped her foot, following after him. In the next half a year, Li Yueming visited the 11 great sects of Lingnan. It also caused a huge uproar among all the martial arts sects in the Lingnan area. "Have you heard? A young man brought an old servant and a maidservant to flatten the Lingyun sect. Ah, it seems that some time ago, that old fart from the flower sect was also killed. D*MN, that old fart from the flower sect is a half-step grandmaster? He was also killed? Was the world so chaotic now? Your news is too outdated. I heard from a friend that that young man has already stepped into the Blue Cloud sect." "Really? You dare to go to the Qingyun sect alone?" "It's absolutely true. That day, that friend of mine saw the Qingyun sect's thousands of sword formations activated. The mountains and rivers changed color, the sun and moon dyed blood. Sigh, the world has really changed. The great Xia dynasty is already at the end of its rope. Who would be the final winner in this new game?" Rumors spread across Lingnan. At this moment, all the martial artists deeply felt the aura of a storm brewing. One had to know that even the weakest of the 12 sects in Lingnan had a very shallow foundation. It had a history of nearly 100 years. It could be said that it was deeply rooted in Lingnan. However, he was only a young man now, and he could actually kill them all by himself. How heaven-defying was this? In the past, when the world was in chaos, monsters would also appear frequently. However, even among geniuses, there were very few existences who could destroy a sect by themselves. In the past 500 years, there was only one super genius who could do this when he was young. That was the founding emperor of the current Great Xia dynasty. The Great Xia martial emperor Long Tiankui, who was invincible in the world with his fists, had forcefully ascended to the throne in that era of contending with hundreds of schools of thought. He also established the Great Xia dynasty, which respected martial arts. From this point of view, what was the background of this rumored youth? They could not come to a conclusion. The youth seemed to have appeared out of thin air, stirring up flowers in the sky above Lingnan before quietly leaving. After the Blue Cloud sect was destroyed, he disappeared from everyone's sight. The legend of the young man leading an old servant and a maidservant to kill until the mountains and rivers changed color still spread across this vast land. Half a year later, outside the pavilion, by the ancient road, a carriage loaded with goods stopped outside the gates of King Duport. The travel-worn old servant got off the horse and carefully lifted the curtain for the owner of the carriage. He said, "Young master, we have arrived at Qingdu Harbor." A young man's cold voice came from the carriage. Did anything go wrong?" The old servant sized up the army at the gate. After observing for a long time, he nodded and said, "Young master, there doesn't seem to be any problem." The young man waved his hand. The old servant didn't say anything more, but looking at the queue that was thousands of meters long, he felt a little awkward. These two servants were Li Yueming and Wang Ermeize. Yananyuan was also sitting in the carriage like a stalker who could not be shaken off. During this half a year, Li Yueming's strength had improved by leaps and bounds, and he was now at the peak of the martial king realm. On this basis, he had swept through the entire southern ridge 12 clans as quickly as he could. Moreover, he brought back all the high-grade cultivation techniques that he felt could be used. It was the end of the year. Li Yueming finally solved the troublesome problem of breaking through to the martial king realm in this year. After half a year of rapid development, the current Qingdeport had long become the most prosperous and vibrant city in Lingnan. Almost all the refugees in the surroundings who did not have enough food or warm clothes and could still walk had gathered here with their families. The passage into the city was packed with people almost all year round. The refugees lining up to enter the city could stretch for several kilometers. Many people slept on straw mats when they were hungry. When she was hungry, she would buy some reasonably priced food from the porters who were carrying the flatbread dough. Some extremely poor people could also receive relief porridge. It could help them fill their stomachs and not starve to death. However, the taste. This was because the city's defense was sufficient. Even martial artists did not dare to disturb the order of the people queuing up to enter the city. If it was in other cities, martial artists might have some privileges based on their status. However, in Qingdeport, which was known as the City of Hope, those 3,000 city guards who wanted your life would really kill you on the spot. He looked at the long queue in front of him. Wang Ermeza felt a rare headache. There were so many people lining up. How troublesome would it be to enter the city? Chapter 81, Remarks on the Release plus Remarks on the Three Rivers. It is the same as the title. First of all, as usual, he would like to thank the editor, Lu Ming, for his support. The failed author had troubled Lu Da a lot by asking for follow-up reading and recommendations along the way. He was also grateful for his various recommendations for this book. Next, he briefly talked about the situation of the entire book. This book had been written since the 1st of last month. It had been written for 1.5 months, and it had a total of 200,000 words. It wasn't much, but it wasn't little either. To be honest with everyone, this book was actually just the beginning of an abandoned manuscript in my hands. It wasn't even written for Kidian's users. The reason why I posted it on Kidian was because I was unhappy with the poor beginning and wanted to struggle a little. When I first posted the book, I even hesitated for a long time whether I should sign the contract or not. He didn't expect that he would be able to go all the way from testing the water to the Sanjiang small horn. It completely exceeded my expectations. Perhaps this was also a sentence. A tree planted with a heart would not live, but a willow planted without a heart would make a shade. That's why you guys kept criticizing me for being illogical and writing casually. Although it didn't feel good, I endured it for the time being, because there were indeed some things that I didn't consider completely when I wrote, but that didn't include whether the baby could open his eyes or whether there was enough food in the sewers. Moreover, the author has always been a double author, so there are often typos and names. I would like to thank everyone for their testimony. I hope everyone doesn't mind. Finally, it was time to ask for a new account. I was going to put it on the shelves tonight, but the editor didn't reply to my messages during the Mid-Autumn Festival, so I can only postpone it until tomorrow after the editor goes to work. The last time he asked, the follow-up reading of this book seemed to be around 2600-2700. Therefore, the author set a rule for adding updates, starting from 2000 first orders. If it exceeded 200 orders, he would add one update, and he would promise to pay off all debts within half a month. As for the other monthly votes and tips, although they shouldn't be of much use, just in case some tycoons patronize, I'll set one up. After it's put on the shelves, it will increase by 100 monthly votes for the author and 100 yuan for the tip. Well, why did it feel a little strange? F***ck, note that 2.5k words count as a new chapter. The author should be writing a 5k chapter. In addition, why do I feel that the chapter is particularly cold every day recently? Do I really have close to 3,000? Could it be fake? Could it be that I'm the one who created the internet water army? In self-doubt. Treasure, Can you report that you've been in the midst of a group of people? Lastly, I'll sacrifice my wronged friends in the group for my initial 3000 UN book. If you're interested, you can go and support me. Chapter 82, Hiding for 2 years, Breaking Through to Grandmaster. 1. He looked at the distant walls of the azure capital harbor. Wang Ermeiza could only choose to pull Li Yueming's carriage to the side. After explaining the situation to Li Yueming, he squeezed into the crowd alone. The side door of the green capital harbor tower suddenly opened, and a well-equipped team appeared. All the refugees and martial artists who were lining up outside the city wall were shocked when they saw the team's attire. F***CK, isn't this the King Deport police squad? Looking at their attire, they seemed to be the most elite group of law enforcement officers. The law enforcement team seems to be directly managed by that person's personal disciple. The lowest level of experts who can enter the law enforcement team is the martial master realm. Why did you suddenly alarm them? I don't know. Could it be that the rebel army has attacked King Deport? Now that you mention it, it does seem possible. A few days ago, Nanwan Port was attacked by the rebel army. Although King Deport is remote, we can't rule out the risk of being attacked. Below the city. Needless to say, he was shocked. The police squad was the most elite squad in the King Deport Defense Force. They enjoyed a high salary. Furthermore, it was directly managed and trained by Han Bufan. Usually, when there was nothing important, they would be cultivating. It was rare to see them. And now, they were all gathered here. Something big must have happened. As for envy, needless to say, on the path of martial arts, except for a very small number of madmen and geniuses, the vast majority of ordinary people pursued nothing more than fame and fortune. The law enforcement team members in front of him had all three of them. How could it not arouse the envy of others? Just as the group of refugees were still discussing, a scene that made them even more afraid appeared. The few law enforcement officers who were leading the team walked out of the city gate. A few more figures walked out from the side door. This group of people were all high-spirited youths, and the oldest was no more than 18 years old. The youngest was probably only 13 or 14 years old. All of them were very calm. Many of the refugees and martial artists who had some understanding of King Deport nearly had their eyes pop out of their sockets when they saw this. These teenagers were the most powerful leaders in King Deport. They were the 16 direct disciples of the legendary Heaven's Chosen One who had massacred King Du Harbor. Although they were young, their strength was extraordinary. Every single one of them was a well-known figure in the current King Du Harbor. After repeatedly confirming that he had not seen wrongly, almost all the refugees and martial artists who were queuing up to enter the city were completely dumbfounded. Who am I? Where am I? Did the sun rise from the west today? Everything happened in reality. Not only did they gather together and walk out of the city gate. Behind them were countless troops. The gates of the azure capital harbor opened. Tens of thousands of armored soldiers swarmed out of the city gate, driving all the queuing refugees and martial artists to the sides of the road, and directly opened up a path of several thousand meters in the crowd. Just to welcome a person into the city. The group of disciples led by Han Bufan and Fu Xiaoro came to Li Yueming's carriage. They bowed respectfully and said in unison, "Disciple welcomes Master. Long live Master." Li Yueming lifted the curtain and swept the disciples. It had been more than half a year since they last met. Compared to the past, this group of children had more determination and maturity on their faces. In such a chaotic era, children tended to mature much earlier than normal people. This group of orphans and disciples who had no parents and no one to rely on were even more so. He retracted his gaze. "Okay, let's enter the city." Li Yueming replied indifferently. The group of disciples stood up. Looking at Li Yueming, his eyes couldn't help but reveal a bit of relaxation. In the past, when Li Yueming was in the city, they wouldn't panic even if the sky collapsed. This was because they knew that even if the sky collapsed, their master would still hold it up. As disciples, they could grow up healthily under the protection of their master. However, ever since Li Yueming suddenly left, they were more nervous. After stumbling and bumping into countless walls, he finally managed to stand on his own after his head was bleeding. Li Yueming was not in the city for a day. Their hearts would not be at peace for a day. He saw his master's face again and heard his master's voice. Even if it was just a faint it was also enough to make the empty hearts of the group of disciples feel at under the gazes of the surrounding refugees, who were looking at him as if he was a god. Han Bufan stood up and led Li Yueming's horse. The carriage passed through the broad road formed by the soldiers and entered the city smoothly. The countless martial artists and refugees who witnessed this all opened their mouths wide. He knew that after all the soldiers had left, he would not be able to close the city. To be treated like this by the higher UPS of King Duport. Other than the legendary Son of Heaven in King Duport, there was no one else. However, shouldn't the Son of Heaven be staying in the city all the time? Why did he suddenly appear outside the city? He looked at Li Yueming's carriage and then at the inland. Chapter 83, Hiding for 2 years, Breaking Through to Grandmaster. 2. Many quick-wit martial artists suddenly thought of something. Do you still remember the news that the 12 sects of Lingnan were flattened half a month ago? Many of the martial artists who had yet to recover from their shock asked in confusion, why did you suddenly bring this up? The quick-wit martial artist thought for a moment. He paused for a moment. In the end, he braced himself and said, Elmine, do you remember the characteristics of the mysterious person who flattened the 12 sects? A cultivator who had yet to come back to his senses subconsciously replied, I heard that a young man had a carriage, an old servant driving the carriage, and a woman to serve him. F***ck, it can't be. Everything came to an abrupt halt. Countless martial artists maintained their silence at the same time. The news that the rumored Son of Heaven in King Duport was the mysterious youth who had single-handedly flattened the 12 Southern Ridge clans some time ago had spread. The entire Southern Ridge was in an uproar. Even the other ports and cities further north had heard the rumors. One could imagine how terrifying the influence and efficiency of this information were. For a very long time, the martial artists in southern China were all discussing related topics. At the very beginning, most of the warriors believed that the mysterious young man who flattened the 12 clans was around 18 or 19 years old. After all, even a super genius needed time to grow. He was already a rare martial arts genius who could only be seen once in 100 years. The so-called Heaven's Chosen One of King Duport was only 13 or 14 years old. If he really was the one who had trampled on the 12 Southern Ridge sects. How unbelievable was this? It wasn't an exaggeration. In the 300 years since the imperial emperor founded the Grand Xia dynasty, there had never been a monster of this level in the entire martial world. He was only 13 or 14 years old, but he had already wiped out 12 second-rate sects in Lingnan. Among them, the Qingyun sect and the other 2 sects had martial arts grandmasters guarding them. If it was true, Li Yueming's existence could overturn the understanding of all Chinese martial artists. Li Yueming could even be classified as a non-human creature for in-depth research. This news was still spreading more and more widely, becoming more and more popular. Almost all of southern China knew that a super genius had appeared in Lingnan. It was said that he was comparable to the martial emperor of Great Xia 300 years ago. In a short period of time, many martial artists in southern Huaxia turned their attention to Lingnan, which did not have much of a presence in the past. The scouts from all over the world also began to take action. Although this news sounded as fake as it could be. But what if it was true? It was still necessary to send a few scouts to investigate. Of course. Almost 90% of the martial artists scoffed at this. After all, a 13 or 14-year-old child had flattened the 12 Southern Ridge sects by himself. This kind of news was obviously against common sense. It was fine if he just ate a melon, but whoever really believed it would have water in their heads. Quite a number of martial artists started to speak. If the heaven son of King Duport and the young man who trampled the 12 Lingnan clans were really the same person, they would stand upside down and have diarrhea. The whole of China's world of martial arts burst into laughter. Although this news had spread far and wide. However, there were very few people who truly believed it. Most of them were just watching the show for fun. After all, foreigners were in power now. The days of martial artists were getting harder and harder. Even the martial arts world slowly turned into a pool of stagnant water. At this time, the appearance of some interesting rumors would help to liven up the atmosphere of the game. Everything in Jianghu had nothing to do with Li Yueming. After entering the King Duport in a carriage, under Fu Zairo's lead, the disciples followed him around the city. Half a year ago, he had left a note for his disciples before he left King Duport. The higher UPS gave them 3 homework tasks. He asked the disciples to carry out the things written on the note before he returned. Now, it was time for the disciples to hand in their answers to him. The first order. The security of King Duport had to be kept open at night for half a year to a year. In order to complete this command, Han Bufan established a small team of law enforcers. It took half a year to complete this feat through various means. Currently, the security of the green capital harbor city should be the safest in China and even the entire world. The second one. While teaching martial arts to the children in the dojo, the disciples must also try their best to break through to the high-level martial master realm. This one was 80% complete. Only a few disciples who were not very talented progressed slightly slower. Of course, things like cultivation couldn't be rushed. As long as the foundation was firm, it didn't matter if it was a little slower. Li Yueming didn't insist on this. As for the last one, that was the overall development of King Duport. In half a year, King Duport had to plant more grain and fish more. They wanted to stock up as much as possible. Fu Zairo, as her assistant, was naturally in charge of this. In half a year, she worked with the talents from all walks of life in King Duport to formulate a complete set of simple laws. Merchants, farmers, martial artists, sailors. Chapter 84, Hiding for 2 years, Breaking Through to Grandmaster, _3. A series of domains. Although the law was very rough and only stipulated a big framework. However, it also greatly increased the vitality of King Duport. Now, the second-generation new fishing boat designed by Li Yueming was already in production. It was estimated that it would be officially formed in March next year. The refugees who were originally settled could basically be self-sufficient and no longer needed the city lord's mansion to continuously provide food subsidies. As long as there were no natural disasters, the crops planted outside the city could be harvested smoothly. With that, King Duport could barely become self-sufficient. One had to know that King Duport was now a super city with a population of nearly 1 million. It was an amazing thing to be self-sufficient in food. Towards all of this, although he had been away for half a year, the development of King Duport had not slowed down at all. Not only that, this was because he had mastered the core fishing technique and the rules and regulations were gradually perfected. The development of King Duport was still increasing. After checking on the development of King Duport, Li Yueming brought a group of disciples back home for a reunion dinner. His mother had found a new job after farming, which was to cook for the children in the Qingdu Harbor School. As a servant from a grassroots background, his mother was content. As long as he could eat and work, he could gossip with his neighbors in his spare time. There were no other special requirements. The only thing that gave Li Yueming a headache was the New Year's Eve dinner had just begun, and his cheap mother was already hinting crazily. Aunt Wang's son was only 13 years old and had already started preparing for a third child last month. Li Yueming was now 13 years old. In fact, she was already close to the legal age of marriage. It was normal for his mother to look forward to her grandson. Li Yueming was completely unable to handle this. Just as he was about to use the urine escape technique to escape, a tall girl dressed in red walked in from the entrance and saw Li Yueming's mother holding his hand and talking about her grandson. The red-robed girl's eyes lit up. She hurriedly ran over and grabbed her mother's hand. "Mom, actually, I'm your daughter-in-law who hasn't married yet. I specially came today to give you a surprise." His cheap mother was still talking about it just now. In fact, she also knew that Li Yueming would definitely not get married easily. But because of this, didn't you get it in advance? Otherwise, in a few years, it would be even more difficult to urge her son to get married after his wings had completely hardened. However, what she did not expect was that she was still mumbling. After that, this ridiculously beautiful girl pounced over and grabbed her hand, calling her mom. He was stunned for a moment. His cheap mother immediately sat up from her chair and said ecstatically, "Really? Come, let mom take a good look at you. Aya, you're too beautiful." He sized Yananyuan up. His cheap mother was very happy. This girl was good. Not only was she beautiful, but she was also tall and had a big butt. It was obvious that she was fertile. When the time came, she would give birth to a few more fair and chubby boys. Then, she would not have to envy her neighbor's grandson. As for Li Yueming's opinion, no one cared about it from the beginning to the end. Li Yueming could only watch. He had to endure it first. Later, he would teach Yananyuan a lesson in private. She seemed to have sensed his anger. Yananyuan coaxed the old lady while pointing her middle finger at Li Yueming. He even stuck out his tongue mischievously. The meaning was simple. "What can you do to me?" After spending half a year with Li Yueming, Yananyuan did not learn anything else, but she had learned all kinds of strange words and gestures. At this moment, the disciple who was eating next to him was in jail even more than Li Yueming. In this war without smoke, they were the youngest and most vulnerable existences. They could not afford to offend anyone at the dining table. He could only bury his head in his rice bowl and be a noob king who did not care about what was going on outside. The New Year's Eve dinner passed in such a peaceful and happy atmosphere. Li Yueming's 13th year in this world was almost over. Li Yueming found an opportunity to grab Yananyuan, who was alone, and said with a dark face, "What do you want?" Yananyuan glanced around with her big, mischievous eyes. After making sure that no one around could save her, she shrunk her neck and said, "I've been sleeping in the same car as you for more than half a year. Don't tell me you won't even give me a status." This girl was a drama queen. It was obvious that she had fallen onto him like a piece of sticky candy that could not be shaken off. Now, she still had the cheek to point at him. "If you're sure, don't go back on your word." Li Yueming sighed. Yananyuan blinked her eyes and made a hand gesture with her small fist. "Hey, this lady wants to be a serf and sing, can't I?" However, it was not a good thing for his cheap mother to keep urging him to get married. Instead of dragging it out, it was better to follow it. Yananyuan's word slow didn't seem that hard to accept. Therefore, after considering everything, he tacitly agreed to this inexplicable marriage that fell from the sky. However, marriage was obviously a matter that had to be put aside. Before that, Li Yueming still had many things to do. Chapter 85, Hiding for 2 years, Breaking Through to Grandmaster, _4. 14 years old, this is a year as an apprentice. Li Yueming locked himself in the courtyard again. Every month, other than eating some dry rations regularly, he would not see anyone. Now, he had all the high-level cultivation techniques of the major sects in Lingnan in his hands. He needed to constantly deduce and turn it into nourishment for the star moon art, and use it to raise his strength to a higher level. In the past 2 years, the situation in the Great Xia dynasty had become more and more chaotic. Uprisings broke out everywhere. In one of the largest battles, farmers holding hoes and carrying poles almost fought to the counties near the capital of the Great Xia Empire. At this critical moment, they had to mobilize the imperial family's martial artist guards to barely suppress them. On the other hand, the foreign forces in the various ports were no longer satisfied with just occupying a few ports. They began to enter the interior in batches. They attempted to occupy more land. A group of foreigners from the Free State, armed with flintlocks and trained in Gokyudo combat arts, galloped across the land of Huaxia without fail. Wherever he went, he would snatch it, and no one could stop him. Although the expansion of the Western European people who held the Holy Book wasn't as aggressive, the impact they caused wasn't any weaker than the bandits of the Free State. After all, burning, killing, and looting were physical attacks. The teachings of the scriptures were a double attack on ideology and culture. Under the pressure they brought, the imperial court, which was struggling to suppress the civil strife, had no choice but to send people to beg for mercy from the foreigners. Moreover, he had directly ceded the sovereignty of several ports. This undoubtedly fueled the arrogance of the foreigners. Thick smoke rose up from the entire land of China. The rich wolves could smell the rotten smell even from a few oceans away. Li Yueming knew that he had to hurry up and equip himself. Once Great Xia collapsed, all kinds of demons and ghosts would appear. He had to bring out strength that was enough to intimidate all directions in order to rise up in the chaotic world. Therefore, he had no choice. A whole year. Li Yueming didn't even step out of the room. In the end, he absorbed all the martial arts cultivation techniques and moves collected by the 12 sections. A considerable portion of these cultivation techniques and moves were dispensable. Only a few of the cultivation techniques and moves of the sects allowed Li Yueming to absorb a lot of nutrients. Li Yueming added these nutrients into the Star Moon technique. Now, he had copper skin and iron bones. His body alone was enough to destroy the world, and his inner chi was more than 3 times thicker than it was a year ago. Even from a distance of nearly 1,000 meters, Li Yueming could kill the enemy with his inner chi. Li Yueming had finally reached the peak of the martial king realm. Although he still felt that he was one step away from perfection. However, Li Yueming knew that it was the one that had been erased by the will of heaven and earth. It was difficult to achieve with just human strength. Time flew like an arrow, and the sun and moon flew like shuttles. 15 years old. Li Yueming had become a martial arts grandmaster in his sleep. He had just advanced, but his aura kept rising until he reached the peak of the martial arts grandmaster realm. In just one night, Li Yueming had broken through from a martial king to a martial grandmaster who was only one step away from a martial emperor. The speed was even faster than a rocket. If other martial artists knew that one could break through to the grandmaster realm like this, they would probably wish they could find a hole in the ground and bury themselves in it. After all, it was too much of a blow. After all, in all senses, the further a martial artist's realm advanced, the more difficult it was to break through. However, Li Yueming was the exact opposite. Because his foundation was strong enough, the further he advanced, the easier it was for him to break through. He started from the martial apprentice realm and cultivated all the way to the martial king realm. Li Yueming would always repeatedly polish every realm to perfection. As a result, most of the time, the power in the body could not hold back and broke through by itself. However, the owner of Li Yueming's body did not know about this. A deep foundation was only part of the reason. The other reason was that Li Yueming had the purple talent of martial Dao Supreme. He was a true martial arts genius. The two combined into one, coupled with the Star Moon art created through the infinite deduction talent. All kinds of coincidences overlapped. As a result, the further he cultivated, the faster his realm breakthrough became. Chapter 86, Chapter 86, Martial Arts Conference, Set Off, L. Chapter 86, Martial Arts Conference, set off, L. After breaking through to the Grandmaster realm, Li Yueming stayed in the room to consolidate his position. The current him was many times stronger than when he destroyed the 12 Southern Ridge sects 2 years ago. He barely had the capital to dominate a region in this chaotic world. Li Yueming left the room after a long time. Cicadas chirped outside the eaves, and his mother's vegetable garden was filled with all kinds of vegetables and fruits. This year should be a good harvest year. Li Yueming picked 2 cucumbers in the garden, washed them, and began to chew on them. The manor was empty. Everyone was busy outside. Li Yueming also took this opportunity to relax his tense nerves. Outside the door was a message tube. This was because Li Yueming had been staying in the house all year round to deduce cultivation techniques and cultivate martial arts. If there was nothing special, no one would disturb him. However, in order to prevent any unexpected situations, the disciples would summarize what happened every month and put it into the information cylinder outside Li Yueming's door. It was convenient for Li Yueming to know about the major events happening in the outside world when he had time. He was chewing on a sweet and crispy cucumber. Li Yueming unhurriedly opened the scrolls and read them one by one. He had finished reading last year's information. Only some things that happened this year hadn't been read yet. Last year, although the uprising armies in various places had been suppressed by the imperial family with tremendous effort, they were still able to suppress the rebellion. However, not only did the world's situation not stabilize because of this, it became even more chaotic. The governors of the various regions no longer trusted the royal family and began to leave the central government and establish their own sections. Although they did not dare to rebel openly for the time being, anyone with discerning eyes could see that it was only a matter of time. This year should have been a bumper harvest. However, under the instigation of various factions with ill intentions, bandits and robbers from all over the world burned, killed, and plundered everywhere. The entire land of China was filled with devastation. Farmers plowed 10,000 mu of land and harvested a grain of rice in autumn. At a glance, all the words were written with the words of cannibalism. However, in this turbulent era, the bones of the poor and peasants were just an insignificant backdrop to the times. The eyes of the world were still focused on those influential figures. South of China, which was the area north of Lingnan, 5 of the 5 tigers of South China had appeared and firmly controlled the 32 cities south of China. They were the most dazzling stars in the struggle for power in the world. In the central and eastern regions of China, there were also famous independent factions. Most of them had suddenly risen in the past 1 or 2 years. All of them were powerful and had deep backgrounds. Not only did they organize and train the army, but they also recruited martial artists with money, power, and beauty. Li Yueming didn't even need to think. More than 90% of these forces that had suddenly appeared were representatives of the great clans and high-level sections. All of them were like wolves and tigers as they stared at that supreme throne of authority within the imperial capital. After 2 years of discussion, the top 5 sects in Huaxia's martial arts world had decided to suspend their seats. They finally decided to launch a wave of retaliatory attacks on the Free State and Western Europe. After all, in the past 2 years, the foreign devils were rampant, causing the entire coastal area to be in chaos. In fact, the one who harmed the most benefits was not the great Xia royal family. After all, the power of the royal family had long existed in name only. Although the various ports were nominally the territory of the great Xia dynasty. However, in reality, it was already in the backyard of martial arts sects and some aristocratic families. Now, the foreigners had occupied all the ports along the coast where trade was developed. The first to jump in panic was undoubtedly the original beneficiary of the port. A vigorous revenge operation began. The Westerners and the 5 great sects suffered casualties. But overall, actually, the Chinese sects were the ones who suffered the most. On the other hand, the Chinese sects would need 7 or 8 years, or even 10 years, to catch their breath. After fighting for half a month, the losses were getting more and more severe. The 5 great sects quickly admitted defeat. The golden bell rang and the disciples sent to the coastal areas were recalled. In order to regain his face, the 5 great sects were talking to the Westerners higher ups through the air, preparing to hold a martial arts conference for all the martial artists in China and the Westerners. The 5 great sects announced to the public that their slogan was friendship first, competition second. Li Yueming thought about it and knew that the 5 great sects were probably afraid of the foreigners, but they couldn't bring themselves to admit defeat. All of them had created such a nondescript martial arts convention. They wanted to use this opportunity to get all the martial artists in the world to come and get back at them. This was also an open scheme. After all, if a martial artist wanted to continue making a living, he had to prove his strength to everyone in the world. Otherwise, how could he raise his head when he was always suppressed by the foreigners? After reading the latest news, Li Yueming stuffed all the scrolls back into the information cylinder. He stood up and walked towards the Kingdeport City Lord's mansion. However, just as he was about to push the door open and leave, he saw a tall figure barge in. It had been almost a year since they last met. Yananyuan looked even more beautiful now. Chapter 87, Martial Arts Conference, Set Off, 2. Although she didn't have any makeup on her face, her skin was as smooth as jade. It made people unable to help but marvel at the good fortune of the heavens. There was actually such a perfect woman in this world. Yananyuan almost bumped into Li Yueming when she walked through the door. A pair of spring-like eyes sized up Li Yueming and said with a hint of joy, "Otaku, you're finally willing to go out." Li Yueming also sized her up. Finally, he stared at Yananyuan's eyes with the beauty mark and asked, "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Yananyuan paused for a moment, which was rare. A moment later, she giggled and said, "The martial arts conference will be held in Zhongzhou Port 2 months later. At that time, our martial artists will fight against the foreigners on the same stage to prove our martial arts reputation. I also want to give it a try and see if I can defeat a few damn foreigners." Li Yueming sized her up and said disdainfully, "With your little arms and legs, don't get killed by a single punch." Yananyuan's face darkened and she said angrily, "Although this lady is not strong, her combat strength is still very good. I warn you not to look down on others." Li Yueming really looked down on him. This little girl was from the village and did not have much knowledge. She probably thought that the Westerner's punching bag was a joke. Seeing that he did not make way, Yananyuan's face turned even uglier. "I don't need your concern. You just hate me and want to chase me away. Hiding in the house for a year or 2 without coming out, I'll pack my things and leave now. You don't have to hide from me anymore." She pushed Li Yueming. However, Li Yueming didn't move at all, and she almost fell on her butt. Yananyuan gritted her teeth in exasperation. He could only walk around Li Yueming. He went back to pack his things. Li Yueming just watched silently. He didn't say anything or stop her. Yananyuan thought that he was hiding in the house to avoid her, but in fact, Li Yueming was just cultivating. Therefore, many things were difficult to explain. Li Yueming liked to be a lone ranger in the reincarnation world. That was the reason. It was difficult to cut off the ties with some people when they were too deep. However, his identity as a reincarnator meant that every acquaintance would eventually become a one-sided parting. Wasn't every parting a great cruelty to him? If I had known it would be so difficult, why didn't I know it at the beginning? Li Yueming was the only one who knew what it was like. He could not share it with anyone else. There were 2 soldiers guarding the door. When they saw Li Yueming come out, they looked at each other and bowed. "Your Highness the Son of Heaven, Her Highness Xiaoro has instructed us to invite you to the City Lord's mansion after you come out of seclusion." Li Yueming nodded and said, "All right." He took a few steps toward the City Lord's mansion. But in the end, he still stopped. Get a few people to help me follow her. Nothing must happen to her. The two soldiers bowed and accepted the order. Li Yueming flung his sleeves and left without looking back. Zhongzhou Harbor was the largest harbor in Zhongzhou, located in the northeast of the coastal area of China. The geographical conditions were excellent, and the weather conditions were also very good. There was an expert in the martial emperor realm guarding it, and it was also the only port that the foreigners did not dare to occupy. The venue of the martial arts convention this time was chosen to be in Zhongzhou port. One could imagine how lively it would be. If he had the time, Li Yueming would definitely not miss this martial arts conference. He still had to deal with some matters that had been left behind in Qingdu port for 2 years. Li Yueming strode into the city lord's mansion. At this moment, Fu Ziro was holding a nautical chart and discussing something with a few navy generals. He saw Li Yueming come in. All the soldiers and generals knelt on the ground. "Master, you're finally out of seclusion," Fu Ziro said excitedly. Li Yueming patted her head. In order to help her manage this huge city, the little girl had suffered a lot. Among the disciples, Fu Ziro was the one Li Yueming doted on the most. "You slouro snorty a sorty why?" She seemed to be dissatisfied with Li Yueming touching her head in front of so many people. However, her body was very honest and her face revealed a happy and satisfied smile. They were intimate for a moment. Fu Ziro brought Li Yueming to the sea map and said, "Master, in the past month or two, many foreign cargo ships and warships have appeared near the waters of Qingdu port. Sometimes, they even chase away the fishing boats we sent out." Following the area that she had drawn with her finger, Li Yueming quickly figured out what had happened. It was not a good thing for foreign warships and cargo ships to frequently appear in the waters around Qingdu port. At the very least, it had a huge impact on the fishing industry in Qingdu port. Fu Ziro feared the strength of the foreigners. Qingdu port was still in a period of rapid development. It would not do any good to have a conflict with the foreigners. Fu Ziro did not dare to act rashly. However, turning a blind eye was obviously not a solution. In the end, he still had to come up with a reasonable countermeasure. Coincidentally, Li Yueming came out of seclusion. Therefore, Fu Ziro naturally handed this headache to Li Yueming to make the decision. Chapter 88, Martial Arts Conference, set off. Requesting initial order. After all, his master had always been extremely smart, and his solutions to problems were as unrestrained as a wild horse. In the end, he would definitely come up with a good idea. Li Yueming touched his chin and looked at the area on the sea map. After pondering for a long time, he suddenly said, "What did you say just now?" Fu Ziro was speechless. She was a little confused by Li Yueming's question. He finally regained his senses and answered, "The foreigners' warships and freighters." Li Yueming looked at her and shook his head. Fu Ziro was speechless. This time, she was completely dumbfounded. What was going on? "What do you mean you didn't see it?" She subconsciously looked at the group of Navy generals around her, only to see that their faces were also filled with confusion. Li Yueming was the only one who stood there and spoke. If it were anyone else, they would have been chased out by now. The ship was on the sea and not on the map. How could he see the warships and freighters of the foreigners if he stayed in the city lord's mansion? It was not easy for him to suppress the desire to ridicule in his heart. Fu Ziro waited for Li Yueming to continue. In her simple view, her master would not shoot without thinking. The reason why she could not understand her master's words was definitely that she was not smart enough. He felt the puzzled gazes of the people around him. Li Yueming didn't keep him in suspense and said, "Have you seen the foreign warships and freighters?" "I only saw a group of pirates." As he spoke, in order to let everyone understand what he meant, Li Yueming picked up the sea map and pointed to the sea area around the port. "Look, This sea area was our Great Xiao's territorial waters a few hundred years ago. Not only are these foreigners allowed to operate here, aren't they a group of pirates? When dealing with pirates, you have to give them the strongest truth in the world. Do you still need me to teach you what to do? Hearing this, only then did everyone wake up from a dream. Although it sounded a little strange, but the logic seemed to be true. The consequences of robbing foreigners could be very serious, but if they used the name of fighting pirates, at least from a legal point of view, King Duport could stand firm. Even if the Westerners wanted to counterattack, they probably wouldn't dare to make too much noise. As for how to deal with the pirates, this was King Duport's best show of the year. Right now, there was still a large group of brothers at the port who were shouting anxiously. Naturally, they didn't need Li Yueming to teach them what to do. After figuring everything out, all the officers, including Fu Xiao, had strange expressions on their faces. Now that the entire Great Xia dynasty was trembling under the iron hooves of the Westerners, they did not dare to resist. Perhaps only their boss would dare to set his sights on the Westerners. Seeing that they all understood what he meant. Have there been enough second-generation fishing boats recently? Li Yueming asked. They better not lose to the foreigners' warships. Seeing this, Fu Xiao quickly put away the messy thoughts in her mind and replied, there are already more than 2,000 second-generation fishing boats in the sea. As long as the foreigners don't send out their warships, our King Duport can easily deal with them. Li Yueming nodded. That's good. The foreigners' freighters are the most important part of our fishing plan. Try to prevent any freighters from leaving King Duport. Fu Xiao nodded. However, after hesitating for a long time, in the end, he still opened his mouth and said, Master, isn't it a little inappropriate for us to do this? After all, the foreigners are not ordinary, you see, powerless to resist. Fu Xiao would never question Li Yueming's decision. But now, she felt a little uneasy. After all, this wasn't a small matter. If he wasn't careful, he might cause Qingdu Harbor to burn itself. Hence, he asked. Li Yueming revealed a cold smile on his face as he said, don't worry, Sir Yang won't be able to care about King Duport for a long time. Fu Xiao finally calmed down. Although she didn't know how her master got the news, Fu Xiao wasn't worried about any accidents. He immediately began to make arrangements. Li Yueming stayed in the city lord's mansion for 3 days. During these 3 days, he formulated the development plan of King Duport for the next 3 years. Then, on a sunny afternoon, he boarded a ship heading to Zhongzhou port. They rushed towards Zhongzhou harbor, which was thousands of miles away. The sea route was much smoother and faster than the land route. However, this ship did not go directly to the Central Plains port. On the way, it would stop at the South Bay port for a period of time to load and unload goods. The entire journey took about a month. Only then could Li Yueming arrive at Zhongzhou port. There were many people on the boat. Sailors, helmsmen, merchants, martial artists. There were all kinds of people from all walks of life. However, they were still at peace with each other. After boarding the ship, Li Yueming knocked on the door of the cabin next door. She looked at Yananyuan, who was carrying many bags with tears in her eyes. Li Yueming raised his eyebrows and smiled. She looked at the frivolous man in front of her. Yananyuan could no longer hold back the grievance in her heart. She said with a sad face, "Lve been with you for 3 years and served you all the way. Even a dog should have feelings for you, right? In the end, you heartless person didn't even send me off when you left." Back then, he flattened the flower sect. Yananyuan shamelessly followed behind Li Yueming. In order not to be despised by the other party, she had been acting as a servant girl all the way. She was just short of sleeping with him. They had formed a deep relationship that Yananyuan believed to be true. Li Yueming had never admitted it. He heard her muttering. Li Yueming couldn't help but tease, "I came here specially to see how you'll be killed by a foreigner with one punch." Yananyuan was speechless. A series of bashful iron fists landed on Li Yueming's body, making banging sounds. But in the end, she still hugged Li Yueming. Li Yueming didn't stand on ceremony and directly pressed her onto the deck of the cabin. Chapter 89, A Dramatic Martial Arts Conference. 1. Yananyuan grew up in the flower sect. Before he met Li Yueming, he didn't even go out of the flower sect. However, one had to know that the women of the flower sect were all very unrestrained. Under such circumstances, Yananyuan's concept of love was simple and unrestrained. If she liked him, she would chase after him. If he couldn't catch it, he would use some clever tricks to snatch it. If she really couldn't snatch it, she would hide far away and cry so that she wouldn't be seen. Under such a view of love, that was why she was so bold that she even dared to call herself Li Yueming's future wife in front of her cheap mother. After all, that day, she had witnessed Li Yueming's one-on-one sword raising the Qingyun sect's insufferably arrogant sword array. When he beheaded the Qingyun sect's elder, she had already completely fallen into Li Yueming's domineering aura. When was a man the most attractive? It was nothing more than a golden spear and iron horse, swallowing thousands of miles like a tiger. No matter what, she was just a woman with more courage. 2 years after Li Yueming went into seclusion, she finally felt that she was a little too annoying. Li Yueming had never revealed any romantic intentions to her from the beginning to the end. However, she always stuck to him like a piece of sticky candy. Her shameless appearance made her look ugly and vulgar. Only then did she decide to pack her things and leave. She was prepared to find a place where no one knew her and cry. Suddenly, she saw Li Yueming appear in the cabin. He pressed her down on the deck of the cabin. He could feel Li Yueming's burning aura. After taking a few deep breaths, Yananyuan finally began to panic. She mustered up her courage and tried to break free, but when she tried to exert her strength, she found that her entire body seemed to be paralyzed and she could not muster any strength at all. She could only blush and say shyly, "That what do you want? We're not married yet." He stared at her silently for a long time. "If my life was just a dream, wouldn't you regret it?" Hearing his words. "What do you mean by a dream in a future?" Yananyuan asked in confusion. Li Yueming didn't answer and just repeated himself, "Do you regret asking me this?" This life was just a bubble in Li Yueming's dream. When she woke up from her dream, everything was over. It was like a bubble bursting under the sun. But to the person in the dream, this dream was her everything. Under such circumstances, it was too unfair for the people in the dream to become husband and wife. Li Yueming couldn't tell Yananyuan everything directly. Therefore, he could only give her a tactful reminder. Even though he didn't understand the true meaning behind her words. However, Yananyuan could feel the seriousness in Li Yueming's expression. He pondered for a long time. Yananyuan then said word by word, "If it's a dream, what's the harm in getting drunk? I don't regret it, I just hope you don't regret dreaming about me." Li Yueming finally felt relieved. He rubbed her head and smiled. "I hope we can meet again one day." Yananyuan was still confused. However, Li Yueming did not continue to explain and left her room. His back was hidden in the outline of the sea. It seemed lonely and bleak. Li Yueming spent most of his time cultivating. Yananyuan came to Li Yueming several times, but Li Yueming ignored her. Everything had its priorities. This martial arts conference was a good springboard for Li Yueming. Everything else had to wait. Only when the merchant ship docked at Nanwan harbor did Li Yueming disembark with Yananyuan to buy some daily necessities. He brought her around South Bay harbor. The merchant ship stayed at Nanwan port for 3 days. After unloading the goods, it set sail again and headed north. This time, Li Yueming's luck didn't seem too good. The merchant ship encountered a storm on its way. He had wasted more than half a month. As a result, when the two of them arrived at Zhengzhou port with the ship, the martial arts convention had already been held for 5 or 6 days. They got off the boat. After receiving the inspection of a few martial artist guards, he also paid a sum of dock fee. Li Yueming finally stepped onto land. This was his first time leaving Lingnan. He looked at the port in front of him. A rough estimate. Just the docks in Zhengzhou harbor alone were at least 10 times larger than those in Qingdu harbor. The number and scale of merchant ships were even more exaggerated. Thousands of bare-chested boatmen were working hard to fix the anchors of the merchant ships that were coming and going to the dock. Their unified shouts shook the sky and earth, giving people a sense of noise. There were even more porters on the shore, almost filling up the docks. The porters lined up to carry the load, unloading the goods on the merchant ship and heading to the warehouse designated by the sponsor. There was a large crowd coming and going, and the thick sweat mixed with all kinds of body odors was extremely pungent. One could imagine how prosperous Zhengzhou port was. Such a rotten and withered world. The coastal areas ruled by foreigners were even more prosperous. It was ironic. After leaving the port along the pier, only then did the crowded situation of the people of Zhengzhou city ease slightly. Li Yueming and Yan Anyuan looked over. The main road of Zhengzhou port was actually paved with green stone slabs. Shops lined both sides of the wide and solid bluestone road, and the sound of hawkers and stalls could be heard everywhere. The only thing that didn't seem too harmonious was that Li Yueming realized that more than half of the pedestrians on this road were foreigners and martial artists. The Westerners were still dressed in suits and gold-rimmed glasses, just like before. They walked on the streets in a refined manner, looking very classy. However, they were even more arrogant than they were 2 years ago. All of them had their noses up in the air and did not look at anyone. On the contrary, the martial artists who passed by would immediately lower their heads and take a detour when they saw this group of Westerners. All of them are like snakes and scorpions. They were all attracted by the martial arts conference. However, for some reason, he was scared out of his wits. He walked straight along the road. Soon, Li Yueming heard many martial artists whispering in a tea stall. "Have you heard? The pavilion master of the Southwest River Pavilion died this morning. The pavilion master of the Wangjiang Pavilion is a mid-level martial arts grandmaster, right? He actually died at the hands of the foreigners. Do you think I'm lying to you?" At that time, the pavilion master of the Wangjiang Pavilion was severely injured. After returning home, he did not even last half an hour before he died. This group of foreigners is too cruel. How did they train their bodies? Not only is he extremely strong, but he's actually invulnerable. Sai, you've already lost 3 matches today, right? If we continue to lose like this, Huaxia martial arts will be finished. Almost all the martial artists were discussing the martial arts conference. Li Yueming didn't even need to go out of his way to get information. As long as they strolled around on the road, they could already understand most of what had happened at the martial arts conference. 5 days ago, the martial arts conference officially began. In order to encourage Great Xia's martial artists to participate in this convention, the 5 top sects of Great Xia had put in a lot of effort. As long as a martial artist could win a battle in the arena, they could choose any ordinary cultivation method of the corresponding realm as a reward. Moreover, the 5 great sects would also reward a top-grade medical treatment kit on the spot to ensure that the martial artist would not have any hidden injuries due to injuries. 5 consecutive wins. The winner could choose 1 high-level martial arts cultivation method and 1 high-level martial arts technique from the 5 top sects as a reward. Apart from the medical kit, the 5 great sects would also reward them with treasures such as weapons and secret techniques. The more victories a martial artist had, the richer the rewards they could obtain. This reward system was very effective. On the day the news was announced, Many martial artists expressed their desire to win glory for martial arts. The foreigners were clearly serious this time. Not only did they gather all the fighters from the Gokyudo dojo in the coastal area of China, but they also gathered all the fighters who were at least level 3. He even specially sent a group of Gokyudo elites from the mainland. According to the rumors, this batch of martial artists were members of the Free States God of Gokyudo Combat Gym. They were the elites among the elites of the Free States Gokyudo Combat Department. After 5 days of intense competition, the martial artists in the ordinary arenas could barely fight the ordinary fighters of the Free State with a 40 to 60 chance. There were wins and losses between each other. After all, every martial artist who was confident enough to appear in a situation like this was an elite of the same realm. Their combat strength was not low. However, on the elite arena, facing the elite members of the Gokyudo God Combat Gym, the warriors of the same realm were in a miserable state. If he went on stage, he would only be beaten up. The pavilion master of the Wangjiang Pavilion mentioned before was a martial arts grandmaster. He was once famous in the northwestern region of China. However, they had only fought for less than 5 minutes. The elite fighter who was fighting him seized the opportunity to punch him to the ground. After enduring another 2 moves, the pavilion master of the Wangjiang Pavilion was carried down and died before the doctor could arrive. Extremely ruthless means extremely strong strength. There was an unparalleled aggressiveness in the brutality. This was the impression that those elite Gokyudo grandmasters of combat had left on the Chinese martial artists. After killing 12 famous martial artists in the elite arena, the 2 of them were stunned. The remaining martial artists did not dare to go up. After all, a martial artist's reputation was important, but the rewards from the 5 great sects were also coveted. However, compared to his own life, it was obvious which was more important. A dramatic scene unfolded. The martial arts convention had only started for 3 days. On the 4th day, the martial artists did not even dare to go up to the elite arena. When this news spread, countless Westerners laughed out loud. He was even more disdainful of so-called martial artists. Who knew how many martial artists' faces had been slapped swollen? Li Yueming took the 2 of them for a spin on the road. When they heard the news, they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The 5 great sects had been high and mighty for hundreds of years and enjoyed countless offerings. In the end, he had to gather all the other martial artists in the world to fight in a martial arts conference. It was simply the biggest joke in the world. Actually, before the battle even started, the martial artist's face had already been completely thrown away. The reason why he still hung it on his face was because he wanted to save face and suffer. The main reason why he had traveled thousands of miles to participate in this martial arts conference was that he had taken a fancy to the cultivation techniques and secret manuals rewarded by the 5 great sections. All along, Li Yueming's method of obtaining cultivation techniques had been very simple and crude. Either kill or rob. But now that he had reached the realm of martial arts grandmaster, he could no longer easily follow the previous set of rules. After all, the forces that he had visited in the past were equally powerful. However, its influence was limited to Lingnan. But now, it was different. It was impossible for him to destroy a first-rate sect with a martial emperor and snatch its core cultivation technique under the watchful eyes of countless people. Putting aside the fact that it was difficult for him to kill a martial royal realm expert with his current strength, he was still a martial monarch realm expert. Even if they took 10,000 steps back, they could really kill him. The chain reaction brought about by the death of a martial emperor was not something that Li Yueming could withstand. Other than burning, killing, looting, and other illegal means, the martial arts conference in front of him was a good opportunity for Li Yueming. He could also show everyone his art of war and see if he could get what he wanted. Chapter 90, The Power of a Finger shocked the entire arena. 1. After gathering information, the 2 of them did not stay in Zhongzhou city for long. Soon, He walked towards the arena where the martial arts conference was held. About half an hour later, the two of them came to a huge square. There were 4 very large martial arts platforms in the middle of the square. It was specially prepared by the 5 great sects for the martial arts conference. Below the martial arts stage, thousands of martial artists and foreign grandmasters of combat were gathered. However, only 2 of the 4 martial arts stages were currently engaged in a battle. The other 2 martial arts stages didn't even have any martial artists watching, let alone sparring. Li Yueming took a glance and quickly understood the reason. Among the 4 martial arts platforms, 2 of them were for ordinary martial artists, while the other 2 were for elite martial artists. On the elite martial arts stage, the local king of wrestling from the Free State had already killed more than 10 famous great Xia martial artists. It was as if one would die if they went up. In front of the elite fighters from the Free State, many of the great Xia martial artists who were slightly famous couldn't even last 10 minutes. Nowadays, no martial artist dared to go up to the elite martial arts stage and fight with those strong foreigners. He only dared to spar with some ordinary grandmasters of combat on the normal martial arts stage. The rules of this martial arts conference were very simple. Fighting at the same realm. Martial apprentice, martial master, martial king, martial grandmaster, and martial emperor respectively corresponded to the rank 2 grandmaster of combat, rank 4 grandmaster of combat, rank 6 king of combat, and rank 8 emperor of combat. He went on stage to sign the life and death order first. If one party fell to the ground or raised their hands to surrender, they would lose. On the highest platform in the square, the 3 groups of people sat together. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed a little awkward. Sitting in the middle were the elders of the 5 sections. Seated to their left and right were the chief curator of Great Xia's Gokyudo Dojo and one of the 6 great priests of Western Europe. Although the elders of the 5 great sects of Great Xia were sitting at the head of the table. However, if one looked closely, one could see the nervousness and awkwardness on their faces, which was completely different from the foreigners who were talking and laughing beside them. The Great Xia dynasty's martial artists had lost a lot of face in this martial arts. The Westerners stood in the elite arena. It was fine if they couldn't beat him, but there wasn't even anyone who wanted to challenge him. After the martial arts conference ended, what happened in the past few days would be spread throughout the world by ships and carriages. At that time, warriors would probably become a complete joke in the 3 great continents. The group of elders had already secretly decided that if no one dared to go to the elite arena to compete today, they could only send the most elite core disciples of their sect to the stage. The thought of core disciples dying here. The elders of the various sects felt their hearts bleeding. He observed the situation in the square. Li Yueming and Yan Anyuan lined up to enter the square. The surroundings were filled with Westerners and martial artists. The 2 of them were mixed in the crowd, appearing inconspicuous. Li Yueming and Yan Anyuan came to a young man with a long sword. The young man had an imposing appearance. Judging from his attire, he should be a disciple from the Heavenly Sword sect. However, at this moment, his expression did not seem too good. The way they looked at Li Yueming was also very cold. He glanced at the 2 of them. He pointed at a thick rock beside him and said, "Use all your strength to punch the rock and shake it before you can enter." This was a meeting between martial artists and grandmasters of combat. If he couldn't even move a gate stone, this disciple from the 5 great sects would not let them pass. Li Yueming didn't say anything. He pointed at the foreigners who were unimpeded and said, "Why don't foreigners need to be checked when they enter, but we need to be checked when we enter?" Hearing his doubts, the young man's expression turned even uglier as he said coldly, "Who do you think you are? You dare to question me?" After staring at the young man for a long time, he finally smiled and said, "One understand. You can't afford to offend Lord Yang, but you can afford to offend an ordinary martial artist like me, right?" The surrounding group of martial artists also revealed embarrassed expressions. He looked at the young man with anger. The young man was speechless. Suppressing the anger in his heart, he coldly glanced at Li Yueming and squeezed out his voice through gritted teeth, "This is the order of the sex elders. If you can't even shake this boulder that was tempered by a grandmaster, I advise you not to enter the venue, lest you lose your lives in vain." In fact, he was already used to bullying the weak and fearing the strong, colluding with outsiders, and so on. As a result, there was no extra fluctuation in his heart at this moment. He couldn't be bothered to argue with this guy. Yananyuan, who was beside him, looked excited. In the past 2 years, she had been training her body with Li Yueming. She was very curious about how strong her body was now. The young man frowned. Yananyuan was the first to step out of the crowd. Fortunately, her face was covered with a thick white veil. Otherwise, with her outstanding looks, who knew how much trouble she would have caused? Li Yueming could still feel a few extremely aggressive gazes. After all, even if her face was covered, Yananyuan's temperament and figure were still too outstanding. Chapter 91, The Power of a Finger shocked the entire arena. 2. For men. Her hazy appearance was even more beautiful. Li Yueming snorted and stomped his foot lightly. Several martial artists with ill intentions felt their hearts thump. He looked at Li Yueming with shock. Yananyuan had already reached out her slender palm and gently patted the huge rock on the ground. The seemingly otherworldly attack landed. The stone shook violently. Although it wasn't a big deal. However, it still caused the surrounding martial artists to widen their eyes. One had to know that this stone was refined from the internal strength of a martial emperor. Although it did not look very big. However, both its weight and hardness were terrifying. It was already very difficult for an ordinary martial king to shake even a third of it. This thin and weak woman in front of him actually sent him flying with a punch. From this point alone, he could tell. His physical strength was probably second to none among the martial kings. The young man was also surprised. Putting away his disdain, he bent down and made an inviting gesture. "Welcome to the martial arts conference. Please come in." Yananyuan was very satisfied with this result. It seemed that her 2 years of hard work had not been in vain. His physique was much stronger than before. Yananyuan gave Li Yueming a thumbs up and stood quietly at the side, waiting for Li Yueming to make his move. After all, she was Li Yueming's #1 fan. 2 years ago, she had already experienced the terror of this young man in front of her. Now, 2 years had passed. Even she had made sufficient progress. What level had this young man in front of him grown to? At this moment, Yananyuan was undoubtedly the focus of the crowd. She looked at Li Yueming. The surrounding martial artists could not help but look at Li Yueming. There was a hint of inquiry in his eyes. Obviously, he was very curious about whether Li Yueming could show his powerful strength like Yananyuan. He ignored their messy gazes. Li Yueming walked straight to the young man and said indifferently, "If I can smash the stone with one punch, can I directly hit the elder?" The young disciple of the Heavenly Sword sect who was originally filled with hatred towards Li Yueming was stunned. All the surrounding martial artists who were queuing up could not help but quieten down. After chewing for a moment, instantly, everyone present went numb. Was this a sentence that humans could arrange? If you smashed the test stone forged by the internal chi of a martial emperor with one punch, why don't you go straight to the sky and stand shoulder to shoulder with the sun? Not to mention that Li Yueming seemed to be underage, it was basically impossible for him to break the test stone that was suppressed by the martial emperor's internal chi with one punch. What did he mean by breaking this stone? Would he be able to skip a grade and beat an elder? He looked at Li Yueming, who had a serious expression on his face. The Heavenly Sword sect disciple's face darkened. He said angrily, "Do you know what you're saying? How dare you insult an elder of the Heavenly Sword sect? Even if you're a martial king realm expert, 10 lives won't be enough to kill you. Li Yueming's expression didn't change much. If I can break this stone, bring me to your elder. Seeing that Li Yueming was still recklessly provoking him, the disciple was completely enraged. He sneered and pulled out the sword in his hand. Don't say that I didn't give you a chance. Fight. If you can't break it, just wait for our heavenly sword sect to hunt you down. This disciple was already prepared to call his fellow disciples over to capture this arrogant fellow in front of him. Seeing that he had agreed, a smile appeared on Li Yueming's face. Everyone looked at him as if he was an idiot. Li Yueming didn't waste his breath. He walked straight to the stone and flicked it lightly with a finger. A crisp sound rang out. Under the terrified gazes of all the surrounding martial artists, the testing stone, which was regarded as a mountain by countless martial artists participating in the martial arts conference, suddenly emitted a sound that made one's scalp explode. The entire surroundings became so smelly that one could smell a pin drop. Even the breathing sounds of the martial artists had temporarily disappeared. Then, under everyone's furious gazes, a few seconds after the crisp sound, the testing stone made by a martial royal realm expert cracked into two halves from the middle. Li Yueming didn't say much. In the blink of an eye, the test stone was shattered into two halves. As a result, none of the martial artists present had made the slightest mental preparation. He could only stare blankly at all of this. After shutting down his brain, he couldn't turn it back on for a long time. Where did this freak come from? He looked like he was at most 18 years old. In the end, he actually shattered the test stone that was forged by the Force Emperor's internal chi with just one finger. All the martial artists suddenly felt as if they had lived their lives on pigs. Li Yueming didn't have any extra expression on his face. Silently retracting his finger, he looked at the disciple in front of him and said again, "El broke it, so please lead the way." Hearing this, the disciple finally recovered from his daze. He sized up Li Yueming. The pupils are contracting violently. He looked at Li Yueming like he was looking at an uncivilized monkey. Now, the way he looked at Li Yueming was completely different. How should I describe this feeling? It was as if he was the uncivilized monkey. Then, she thought of his rude behavior from before. The disciple broke out in a cold sweat. He hurriedly knelt on the ground and kowtowed. Disciple failed to recognize Mount Tai. "Senior, please don't blame me." He couldn't be blamed for being cowardly. Li Yueming's punch was too terrifying. One had to be at least a high-level martial arts grandmaster to be able to break the test stone refined by a martial emperor's internal chi with one finger. Such a young high-level martial arts grandmaster. In this era where martial emperors did not appear and martial saints were on the decline, a high-level martial arts grandmaster represented supreme power. Not to mention that he was just an ordinary disciple of the heavenly sword sect who did not have much of a sense of existence. Even if they were core disciples, he had to be extremely careful in front of this person. This disciple wished he could slap himself twice on the spot. What sin had he committed to provoke such a great god? This book had been read more than 3,000 times before it was put on the shelves, but in the end, the first order was cut in half and only had a little more than 1,600. Everyone had been f***ed up. There was still a chapter last night, but his Deo heart was unstable and he played games all night. From today onwards, the author will update at least 10,000 times a day for a month. Everyone can supervise him. Other than special circumstances such as being sick or having something to do, he will update 3 to 4 times a day. If the word count is less than 10,000, you can live stream and beat the author up. Therefore, please watch the pirated Big Shot Stop Whoring. Even if you want to whore, order a little. Small authors can't afford to be hurt. Chapter 92, Chapter 92, 10 consecutive wins, Martial Emperor Technique, _L. Chapter 92, 10 consecutive wins, Martial Emperor Technique, _L. The young disciple wanted to slap himself twice. He was afraid that Li Yueming would punish him. However, it was obvious that Li Yueming would not argue with him. "Take me to see your sect master." The young disciple hurriedly stood up and said, "Thank you for sparing my life, senior. Please follow me. I'll bring you to see the sect master immediately." At this moment, he was afraid that he would lose two legs and make Li Yueming unhappy, so he quickly walked in front and led the way. The surrounding group of martial artists almost all held their breaths when they saw this scene. Even people in the square not far away heard the noise and looked over. Li Yueming became the focus of the entire martial arts conference. One had to know that the martial arts convention had been going on for so many days. Big shots usually greeted them in advance. People like Li Yueming, who had silently emerged from the crowd, were a minority. Moreover, when they saw how young Li Yueming was, they couldn't help but raise their eyebrows. Compared to the martial artist's surprise, the group of foreigners seemed to be more disdainful. He glanced at Li Yueming, his eyes filled with disdain. In their eyes now, the so-called martial artists of Great Xia's Central Plains, and even the entire Chinese population of Great Xia, were all good-looking but useless. They were only slightly stronger than the uncivilized barbarians. Compared to Li Yueming, they were more interested in Yanan Yuan, who was beside Li Yueming. Many foreigners whistled at Yanan Yuan from afar. He even made all kinds of obscene gestures. Yanan Yuan sneered. Li Yueming glanced at the group of foreigners and didn't say anything. Under the respectful guidance of the disciple, Li Yueming quickly passed through the crowd of martial artists. He went straight to the high platform in the square. A group of elders from the 5 great sects, as well as the foreigners from Western Europe and the Free State, were all seated there. The atmosphere on the high platform was somewhat solemn. A disciple actually brought a male and female young strangers onto the stage. A white-haired old man sitting in a high position frowned and asked, "What's wrong?" The disciple who led the way glanced at the fiendish Li Yueming behind him and then at the even more fiendish master in front of him. He could not help but bite the bullet and explain, "That first elder, this senior had just shattered the test stone left behind by the grand elder with just a finger. Disciple really had no choice but to bring him over to find you." The words of the disciple leading the way were beyond his understanding. The old man finally came back to his senses. He jumped up from his chair and said, "What did you say?" The aura that erupted from his body made the scalp of the disciple leading the way go numb. He could only repeat what he had said with great difficulty and add more details. After listening to his speech, the old man finally confirmed what had happened. All the elders on the stage looked at Li Yueming. Li Yueming was the center of attention. If someone else had come under such circumstances, he would definitely feel an incomparably huge pressure. After all, none of the elders and Westerners on the stage were below the Grand Master realm. The pressure brought about by dozens of gazes sweeping over at the same time was enough to scare ordinary martial artists to pee their pants on the spot. But Li Yueming was still as calm as ever. "No matter how they looked at it, I wouldn't budge." The white-haired elder of the Heavenly Sword sect looked at Li Yueming in disbelief and said, "Ls what my disciple said just now true?" Even though he had confirmed it twice. The old man still couldn't connect Li Yueming, a young man who hadn't even grown hair, to a super expert who shattered the test stone made by the martial royal realm grand elder of the section. If he wanted to shatter that testing stone, he would have to use his full strength. In other words, if the disciple's description was true, in terms of physique, this 18-year-old young man in front of him was even stronger than a 100-year-old old man. No wonder he was so shocked and repeatedly asked if it was true. Li Yueming nodded and said, "Of course it's true." The elder of the Heavenly Sword sect looked at his old white hair and then looked at Li Yueming's young and handsome body. For a moment, he felt that his Dao heart was unstable. He had already become a martial arts grandmaster at the age of 20. How could he, an old man over 100 years old, deal with himself? The elders of the other sects also widened their eyes. Clearly, they were also shocked. However, Li Yueming obviously didn't come here to show off his strength. He said directly, I helped you win the elite arena. What reward are you going to give me? The elders only came back to their senses after hearing this. He looked at Li Yueming, who was not far away, and then looked at the empty elite arena below the stands. The fact that no martial artists dared to enter the elite arena had always been a heartache for the 5 great sections. As one of the top 5 sects in China, the sect was the most powerful. He organized a martial arts competition to spar with the Westerners. In the end, after a few days of fighting, the Westerners were too powerful and ruthless. Chapter 93, 10 Consecutive Wins, Martial Emperor Technique, _2. In the end, no one even went up to compete. It could be said to be a great humiliation. He heard that Li Yueming actually intended to fight against the Westerners on the elite martial arts stage. The group of elders' thoughts immediately became active. The elder from the Heavenly Sword sect asked calmly, what reward do you want? The other elders around also pricked up their ears. He wanted to hear what conditions Li Yueming would propose. Li Yueming stated the highest price he had in mind, 3 martial royal realm cultivation techniques and 3 martial royal realm secret manuals. Hearing this condition, all the elders gasped. Although he was mentally prepared. However, when he heard Li Yueming's demand for such a high price. However, he still couldn't help but frown. Among them, an elder of the Tianxian sect, one of the 5 great sects, stood up and said, young man, do you know that you are asking for an exorbitant price? Li Yueming glanced over coldly. The killing intent and brutality frightened the elder of the Heavenly Xian sect. After looking around slowly, Li Yueming said, your 5 great sects monopolize the cultivation methods. The slightly stronger cultivation methods and secret manuals were all seized by you. In the end, you put them on the shelf and stopped them from being leaked out. You are the main culprits behind the fall of Great Xia's martial arts to the state, and now you dare to say that I'm asking for too much. He did not show any mercy. Even below the high platform, countless martial artists looked towards the source of the sound. They were not even in the mood to watch the battle on the martial arts stage. Everyone was curious about who dared to speak so arrogantly in front of the elders of the various sections. More than 100 years ago, martial arts flourished in the central plains of Huaxia, and the various sects clashed frequently. The current status of the 5 great sects was also due to the illustrious military achievements they had made during that period of time. At that time, the martial saints of the 5 great sects had formed an alliance. They joined forces to suppress many of the top-notch sects at that time. The entire martial world was filled with blood. Countless cultivation techniques and secret manuals that had been passed down for hundreds of thousands of years were lost during that period. Later on, there were always rumors in the martial world. It was said that the top-notch martial arts and secret manuals were evenly divided among the 5 great sections. In order to prevent the cultivation technique from being leaked, the 5 great sects had even used many underhanded methods to cause the extermination of those sects with high-grade cultivation techniques. It was all for the sake of maintaining his position as the ruler of the entire Huaxia martial arts world. However, the 5 great sects had done it very secretly. No one had found much evidence. Moreover, many martial artists and Jianghu forces who had investigated this matter had quietly disappeared from history. As a result, later martial artists did not dare to touch this part of history. All the bloodshed faded away with the passage of time. There was actually someone who dared to speak in such a manner on such an occasion. Did he really have monstrous strength, or did he have the guts of a bear or a leopard? The group of elders turned ashen. In broad daylight, this young man who hadn't even grown his hair yet actually dared to mention that taboo history in front of them. This kind of behavior was no different from slapping them in the face. After he reacted, A group of elders from the five great sects retorted angrily, "What do you know? Don't think that you're amazing just because you have some talent. You have to know that there's always someone better than you." He stood up and walked in front of the elders. "Whether I'm amazing or not, you can try it now. Don't tell me that there's always someone better than me. I don't buy it." As he spoke, he revealed his white teeth. To him, these people in front of him were just a bunch of old antiques. If it wasn't for the fact that the situation in the world hadn't reached that stage yet. Now, he wanted to kill this group of old and disrespectful wretches. Being threatened by him. Immediately, an elder could not help but want to attack. An old man with age spots sitting in the center slowly said, "Sit down." He heard the old man's voice. The group of elders' expressions changed. However, in the end, they all sat back down obediently. The old man looked up at Li Yueming and said, "Since ancient times, heroes have been born. In this era of declining martial arts, it's not easy for a young man with such boldness to appear. How can the five great sects neglect him?" Li Yueming raised his eyebrows. This old man was quite interesting. No matter how one looked at it, he was an old antique with half a foot in the ground. However, it still gave Li Yueming an unfathomable aura. It was obviously not simple. Seeing Li Yueming's interested expression, the old man couldn't help but sigh and smile. The old me can agree to the conditions that young friend has mentioned. However, it is not so easy to obtain 6 martial monarch realm cultivation techniques within 15 days. You will win 10 matches in a row on the elite martial arts stage. I will personally give you the cultivation technique. Li Yueming finally understood what this old man was trying to do. She spoke first and praised him, praising him highly. She used some bullshit praise like heroes from youths to gain his favor. Not only did it show the magnanimity of the five great sects, but it also foreshadowed the future. After all, with the old man's status, ordinary martial artists would probably be proud of themselves after being praised. How could he have noticed the trap? And the final pit of this round of flattery was buried in the elite martial arts stage's 10 consecutive wins. By now, all the martial artists had already heard of how terrifying the Westerners on the elite martial arts stage were. The old man who had been watching the battle from the beginning to the end naturally knew. Therefore, he had specially asked Li Yueming to challenge him. Let's not talk about whether Li Yueming could win or not. Even if he could win, he couldn't possibly win 10 matches in a row, right? As long as they lost one match. With the ruthlessness of those foreigners, they would at least cripple Li Yueming. The old man did not need to pay any cultivation techniques. He also used the hands of the foreigners to get rid of Li Yueming, the youth who had embarrassed the five great sects in public. This was the so-called old man's shrewdness. As for whether the Chinese martial artists would lose a battle general because of this, clearly, neither the old man nor the five great sects cared about this. It could even be said that they were happy to see it. The reason why the five great sects were holding this sparring session under the guise of the Martial Dao Convention was that they were all from the same section. It was just a superficial excuse to clear the name of Huaxia's martial artists. In the end, the reason was that the constant expansion of the Westerners had affected the interests of the five major sections. The five great sects needed to display the strength of the so-called Chinese martial artists to negotiate with the foreigners. However, as a top sect, they did not want to waste their sect's strength. Therefore, they set up the Martial Arts Conference to gather all the martial artists in the world as bargaining chips on the negotiation table. It would be even better if they could take the opportunity to let some of the second-rate sects that could threaten their status lose a few core members. And the reason why no martial artists were willing to go up the martial arts stage at the moment was because they were not willing to do so. It was also because some people discovered that the five great sects had only dawdled from the beginning to the end, not even sending out a few core disciples. This was why he was unwilling to continue fighting with his life on the stage. After all, they were a group of low-level martial artists fighting to the death below the stage. For the so-called justice and glory of martial artists, they shed their blood. The truly powerful martial artists on the stage were sitting on the fishing platform. The same group of foreigners were chatting and laughing. Under such a strange scene, how could the martial arts conference become hot-blooded? After all, his purpose of coming here was to obtain the martial royal realm cultivation techniques and secret manuals. He couldn't even be bothered to care about the **t of clearing a martial artist's name. As for whether he was being used as a gun, that would depend on who had the last laugh. Chapter 94, One Kick, Killing the King of Fighters in an Instant, 1. The so-called martial arts conference was actually a bloody feast. Under the pretense of winning glory for martial arts. In fact, a group of hot-blooded ordinary martial artists were just chips on the table of the top 5 sects in the game. It had to be said that this was an extremely dirty act. Fortunately, not all martial artists were fools. In the end, there were still people who saw through the 3 sects' plans. He looked at the smiling old man on the stage. Judging from the clothes he was wearing, he should be the Grand Elder of the Primordial Chaos Limitless sect. After arranging the causes and effects and various risks one by one. Looking at the Supreme Elder of Primordial Chaos Limitless sect who thought victory was in his hands, he revealed a row of white teeth and said, "It's settled then. You guys can go and prepare the cultivation methods now. As long as the 6 martial royal realm cultivation methods are in place, I will accept them even if there are twice as many, let alone 10 Westerners." Hearing that he actually wanted the 5 great sects to prepare the cultivation methods first. The expressions on the faces of all the elders on the stage became very interesting. Someone even slammed the table and stood up. Li Yueming was unmoved. With your shameless personalities, you might really renege on your debt. The group of elders on the stage immediately became angry again. Li Yueming was simply too arrogant. He actually dared to mercilessly taunt the 5 great sects in front of so many people. In the end, it was the Supreme Elder of the Limitless sect who stood up and finalized everything. He took out a token and handed it to an elder beside him. Go to the sect and get 6 martial emperor level cultivation techniques. You must be satisfied. Even though the Supreme Elder of the Limitless sect was still smiling at this moment. However, the coldness in his voice also revealed the anger and killing intent in his heart at that moment. However, there was an old saying. If you don't die when you're old, you're a demon. Under such circumstances, the Grand Elder still controlled his emotions very well. Li Yueming could only secretly give a few thumbs up in his heart. However, since the Hunyuan sect had already sent someone to retrieve the cultivation technique, it was impossible for them to do so. Li Yueming's sarcastic verbal attacks had achieved their goal. After all, he did not want to continue staying in this unlucky place to wait for his cultivation technique after beating up the Westerners. He withdrew his gaze from the elders of the 5 great sections. Li Yueming's gaze finally landed on a group of Westerners sitting not far away. Most of the people sitting next to them were Grand Masters of Combat from the Free State, and less than 1/3 of them were Holy Fire missionaries from Western Europe. Although there were less than 20 of them. However, they were basically the most powerful and powerful higher UPS among the foreigners stationed in Great Xia in the Free State and Western Europe. Lumling's gaze swept across them 1dy1. The foreign adults sized him up with great interest. Even though they were higher UPS, they basically didn't know the Great Xia language. However, there was still a translator present. This group of high and mighty Westerners naturally knew what Li Yueming was going to do next. However, it was a pity. None of them cared about Li Yueming. After all, in their opinion, Huaxia martial artists always liked to talk nonsense. But in the end, reality proved time and time again that their path was correct. The so-called Huaxia dynasty. In their eyes, it was just a rotten and smelly native civilization. Li Yueming didn't feel much. The reason why he took a second look at this group of foreigners was so that he could eliminate the roots when he cut the weeds in the future. There was no other meaning. Below the high platform, the group of martial artists had already exploded. Many information peddlers hidden among the crowd had already spread the latest news. In less than half an hour, all the martial artists in the streets and alleys of Zhengzhou port received the news. F***CK, someone wants to challenge the elite martial arts arena again? Do you want to die? I heard that the challenger this time is very extraordinary. He actually dares to contradict the high-ranking Grand Elder of the Primordial Chaos Limitless sect in public. Really? Don't lie to me. Who cares if it's true or not? Wouldn't we know once we go over and take a look? Now, it's all over the city. If we don't hurry up, we probably won't even be able to occupy a corner. Sigh, forget it. I'm already completely disappointed in Huaxia's martial arts and the 5 great sects. I'll only lose face for no reason if I go. Don't. I heard that the challenger this time is really not ordinary. Although the 5 big sects are annoying, this martial arts convention is still the best stage for us Chinese martial artists to prove our strength. Countless news spread throughout the entire Central Plains port. In less than 2 hours, the originally deserted martial arts practice field was surrounded by tens of thousands of martial artists. In the beginning, the 5 sects were still sending people to maintain order. In the end, the situation was out of control. He simply gave up. They allowed the martial artists to occupy space everywhere to watch the battle. If one were to look down from the sky, they would discover that the entire martial arts conference square was filled with dense figures. The eaves, beams, and even the windowsills of the residence houses were surrounded by the figures of martial artists. What happened in the morning had already spread throughout the streets and alleys of Zhengzhou port. As a result, even many commoners had the courage to find a place to watch the show. Under the gaze of tens of thousands of people, everything about this battle would be magnified infinitely. Once the martial artist on the stage was defeated. If that was the case, half of the martial artists in Huaxia would have their bones broken. The battle had yet to begin. The discussions of the countless martial artists in the surroundings had already drowned out all the other voices. I heard that the challenger asked the Grand Elder of the Hunyuan sect for 6 martial emperor level chi methods. So brave. You're really not afraid of death. Don't mention it. The Grand Elder of the Mixed Essence sect has already sent someone to retrieve the cultivation method, but in contrast, that challenger has to win 10 consecutive matches in the elite arena. 10 consecutive victories. Did he want that challenger to die? Who says so? The 5 great sects deserve to be punished. To agree to such harsh conditions, is the challenger crazy? The Westerners would not show mercy. If there was a slight mistake, they would really kill him. Who knows? Maybe he's going crazy thinking about cultivation technique manuals. Can I complain? I advise you to be careful with your words. Forget it, I'm going to go all out. Today, I have to say a few vulgarities to feel good. The 5 great sects are a bunch of F***ing scumbags. Tui, with the name of the highest sect in martial artists, they do all kinds of things to attack martial artists. All kinds of discussions could be heard. At this moment, the group of martial artists could feel the sinister intentions of the 5 great sects even more. How was this a martial arts convention? They were clearly using this group of martial artists as guns and toying with them like dogs. He knew that the Westerners were powerful. He actually allowed the person on the stage to win 10 matches in a row. This was clearly a rhythm that didn't want the competitors to leave the martial arts stage alive. No matter what they thought, this battle was already an arrow on the bowstring and had to be fired. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a large group of Gokido grandmasters of combat from the Free State went up to the resting area of the elite arena. They were all strong and muscular. His arms were so thick that he could run a horse, and his entire body was filled with incomparably tight muscles. Li Yueming accompanied Yan Anyuan to buy some delicious snacks on the. At this moment, he was walking unhurriedly to the other end of the martial arts field. Li Yueming and Yan Anyuan's appearance was extremely abrupt compared to the dozens of fierce Westerners who were in the limelight. The two of them slowly made their way out of the crowd. Yan Anyuan was still holding 2 sticks of candied haws and a few sugar cakes. He was eating while joking with Li Yueming. When the two of them strolled leisurely into the martial arts stage, almost all the martial artists were confused. What the hell? Is there a problem with me, or is there a problem with the martial arts conference? How could these two kids dare to do this in front of so many people? However, before the group of martial artists could recover from their shock, the disciple in the middle of the field spoke first. Both parties are in position. This competition is an elite arena. The level of the martial arts grandmaster is against the rank 6 fighting king. As soon as he said this, all the martial artists around the martial arts square fell silent. He looked at Li Yueming, who was about to go on stage, and was completely silent. When they heard that someone wanted to challenge the elite, almost all the martial artists thought that the challenger would be a famous powerhouse. After all, a martial artist's blood essence and physique were at the peak stage of 30 years old. Martial artists at this age were the best at fighting. It was not good to be too young or too old. However, the baby-faced child in front of them had given them a head-on blow. Is this kid an adult yet? He actually dared to go on the martial arts stage. And they were fighting in the elite arena of the Tier 6 King of Combat. They didn't even know whether they were crazy or the world was crazy. Or perhaps he had brought his brain with him when he went out today. After reading out the rules of the competition, what they thought would be a tsunami was replaced by a pantomime. After all the martial artists' brains had short-circuited. It was obviously unrealistic to expect them to react at this moment. Fortunately, Li Yueming didn't care. He walked up to the martial arts stage. He looked at the muscular foreigner who was a head taller than him. Li Yueming took a deep breath and said, although compared to IVIO is more convenient for me, however, it's not good to win too easily, lest people accuse me of spending money to fake the match. So, I'd better queue up one by one. The Westerner obviously couldn't understand Li Yueming's words. He twisted his neck. After all, the most important thing for a pugilist was weight, strength, and weight. However, the opponent in front of him did not have any. He looked no different from a person who had never trained before. The king of fighters of the 6th step had already thought of how to kill this weakling in front of him. However, before the smile on his face could completely disappear, he felt his vision blur for a moment, and a blurry afterimage seemed to have appeared. Before he could react, he realized that he was already more than 10 meters in the air. As he fell, only then did the king of fighters of the 6th step feel that his body had been completely separated from his head. Bang! It was only then that the Westerner saw everything on the ground clearly. Li Yueming had appeared 1 meter in front of him. He supported himself with his left foot and kicked diagonally with his right foot. In an instant, his head and body were separated into 2 parts. Only then did the body that was as majestic as a lion and tiger slowly fall. Chapter 95, 8 Combo. The Westerners were scared sh. *. 1. He kicked in the air. The Free State's elite king of combat's head flew up. He didn't even have time to close his eyes when he fell to the ground. Such a fierce kick! It caused the minds of all the martial artists present to short-circuit once again. The CPU burned twice in a row in just 10 seconds. Was there really nothing wrong with this world? Why was it that his 3 views had been thrown to the ground and rubbed again and again in a day? He looked at the young man on the stage. The shock that countless martial artists felt in their hearts was comparable to the explosion of the sun. Oh my God, did I forget to bring my head with me when I went out today, or has the world really gone crazy? That kick just now was so fast that it left an afterimage, right? Was this really a physique that a young man could possess? He actually killed an elite fighting king with a single kick. How terrifying! Who knows where this young man came from? No one in the younger generation of great Xia could match his combat strength, right? Could it be the disciples of those hidden sects who walk the world? Other than that, I can't think of any other possibility. Although the 5 great sects are strong, I've never heard of such a fierce person among their core disciples. Forget it, those reclusive sects can't wait for the martial arts to die quickly. It's not impossible to expect their disciples to come out and save the situation, but it's also very unlikely. So, no one really knows where this young man came from. After a brief silence. On the martial arts stage, the host disciple who was also stunned announced Li Yueming's victory. Only then did the group of martial artists recover from the suffocating silence. The surrounding tens of thousands of martial artists immediately exploded. Almost all the martial artists were discussing Li Yueming's background. In their opinion, ordinary small families would definitely not be able to nurture such a young super expert. Even the 5 great sects didn't have the ability to do so. Only a few legendary secluded sects that were above the world might have a chance. Their discussion was destined to be fruitless. However, in a few days, Li Yueming's identity would be dug up to the 18th generation of his ancestors. In the arena, the group of martial artists were still discussing Li Yueming's background. The surrounding ordinary people who were watching the show still cheered. Good fight. Kick this group of stinking Westerners to death. Little brother is super handsome, young, and promising. Ha ha ha, I thought that the foreigners were really lawless. I didn't expect that our great Xia still had martial artists who could kill foreigners. Hurry up and send these damn foreigners home. They are a group of lawless bandits. The surrounding ordinary people who had heard the news did not care so much. They didn't know how strong Li Ming was or how strong the foreigners were. Martial arts grandmasters and the king of fighting were all things in the clouds to them. Anyway, in their simple minds, as long as Li Yueming won, he would be awesome. They cheered. The surrounding martial artists heard the cheers of the ordinary people. Her ears couldn't help but turn red. In the past, they were used to riding on the heads of ordinary people and doing whatever they wanted. He had never opened his eyes to see this group of farmers who worked at sunrise and rested at sunset. They felt a rare sense of guilt. Ordinary people regarded Li Yueming as a great hero who resisted and attacked the foreigners. However, such a great hero had never stepped forward before Li Yueming. Many martial artists clenched their fists and secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Many martial artists also began to cheer for Li Yueming. Li Yueming had won his first battle on the elite martial arts stage, and it was an undisputed instant kill. This was a huge boost to the morale of the martial artists. At least, not all martial artists were idiots. There were still powerhouses who could contend with the Gokido grandmasters of combat among the Westerners. Li Yueming retracted his leg and looked at the host who was still in a daze. He asked, "This should count as my win, right?" He looked at the Westerner's corpse on the ground, which was still spurting blood. The host disciple from the 5 great sects couldn't help but swallow his saliva. To be honest, he had presided over so many battles in the elite dojo. Generally speaking, it was the Westerners who killed the martial artists. It was the first time he had seen a ruthless person like Li Yueming kick a foreigner's head off. The disciple hosting the martial arts arena hurriedly said, "The great Xia martial artists have won this match." According to the procedure and rules, the disciple should have asked for the foreigner's opinion, or touched the foreigner's nose to see if he was unconscious. But now, looking at the Westerner's head that was still spurting blood, the martial arts field disciple felt that even if he skipped the step, the other party would not have any objections. Therefore, the results of the battle were announced. After the announcement, the tens of thousands of people around the training field were silent for a moment. After a while, they erupted into earth-shattering cheers. Even the disciple who was reading the message felt a trace of excitement and hot blood, not to mention the other martial artists around him. All of them wished they could raise their heads to the sky and vent the anger in their hearts. Including the Grand Elder of the Hunyuan sect. A large group of elders from the 5 great sects also opened their mouths wide. Obviously, no one had expected that Li Yueming would display such terrifying strength as soon as he entered the arena. Part 5 of the series ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe so we can be motivated to make even better videos in the future.